When everything falls apart in an instant, every action you take can turn against you. A single word, spoken in a moment of shock, can become a weapon in the hands of justice. Angelika's story is an example of how an unexpected chain of events can change a life forever. The Hudson Valley is an idyllic spot for outdoor adventures. The stunning nature and swift river draw on those who crave a thrill. Kayaking is a favorite sport for risk-takers, but the river can be merciless. Experienced athletes know this, but sometimes even they aren't immune to mistakes. Angelika Graswald and Vincent Viafore loved the water. To them, it was a symbol of freedom and closeness. On that fateful evening of April 19, 2015, they set out on the Hudson once again, full of excitement. Both were used to challenges and had years of experience behind them. But that day, the Hudson was not on their side. The rising winds stirred up powerful waves, and despite their instincts telling them to turn back, they decided to push forward. Their destination was an island with a castle inspired by Scottish traditions, a place that drew them every time with its mystery and ancient atmosphere. They spent the day enjoying nature, but when evening came, the situation took a sudden turn. The strong waves and icy waters were an ominous sign, but they had no choice but to head back. Staying on the island without gear for an overnight stay was just too risky. When Vincent's kayak began to take on water, the situation took a tragic turn. Without a life jacket and in the cold water, Vincent found himself in a critical situation. Angelika, overwhelmed by shock, called the emergency services. In desperation, she explained that she couldn't reach him due to the powerful waves and that the current was pulling him further away. The dispatcher struggled to pinpoint the couple's location, further complicating the situation. Time was slipping away, and every second counted. Vincent was already slipping under the water when rescuers set out to find him, but by the time they reached the area, it was too late. Vincent was nowhere to be seen from the shore. The darkening sky only added to the somber mood of the event. Let's learn a bit more about Angelika. At 35, Angelika was a woman with serious ambitions. She was pursuing photography and saw it as her future. However, her real name was Angelika Lips. Originally from Latvia, she sought a better life beyond her homeland. 2 marriages, 2 divorces, but her goal remained the same. She wanted to settle in the U.S., obtain a work visa, and build a career. She got lucky. She landed a job as a nanny and moved to the States. But the real changes began when she met Vincent. At 46, Vincent had been through 2 divorces and was successful in the construction business. Despite the age gap, their relationship progressed quickly. Now let's take a closer look at Vincent. Vincent was a generous person. He hosted parties, gathered friends, and led a lively and active life. It was at one of these gatherings that he and Angelika met. Just a few weeks later, she moved into his home in a small town called Poughkeepsie, New York. Their relationship moved fast. Talks about marriage and children became a regular topic. But beneath the surface, there were issues brewing, which only intensified the day before the tragic event. On April 18, 2015, just a day before the accident, Vincent and Angelika went to another party. Vincent was having a good time with his friends, but Angelika left early, claiming she wasn't feeling well. She barely interacted with others and seemed distant. Vincent's friends noticed the tension between them, which escalated into a minor but noticeable disagreement. However, nothing significant happened that evening. They went their separate ways that night, reuniting only the following morning. That's when Vincent shared his plans for kayaking. He was determined for them to patch things up and head out on the Hudson River to spend some quality time together. Let's go back to that tragic day. Despite the cold weather and increasing wind, Angelika agreed to the idea. The couple planned to visit Bannerman's Castle, located on an island in the middle of the river, for a photo session. Angelika brought along elegant outfits for various shots, hoping to capture some great images. By noon, they were at the water's edge, ready for another adventure. But the wind, which was growing stronger, seemed to foreshadow trouble. Massive waves rose around them, and the cold made every movement stiff. Angelika noticed the worsening weather. but Vincent's love for adrenaline and his stubbornness pushed them to continue. Before setting off, Vincent said something that Angelika would never forget. "This will be the adventure of your life." Those words would take on a new, haunting meaning just hours later. The journey to the castle went smoothly. Angelika told the police that they had shared a couple of beers before setting off, just to set the mood. They both knew they needed to stay sober, given they had to make their way back. But despite this, everything changed on the way back. Vincent started to fall behind as the waves grew taller. He shouted that his kayak was taking on water. Angelika turned around and saw his vessel sinking. She tried to turn back, but the tidal current pushed her toward the shore. Once she reached land, she called emergency services. But by that time, Vincent had already disappeared into the cold waters of the Hudson River. The evening of April 19th, 2015, marked the beginning of a search that lasted through the night and into the next day. Divers plunged into the murky waters of the Hudson, searching for Vincent's body, while a sonar-equipped boat battled fog and rough waves. Rescue helicopters scoured the area, but all efforts were unsuccessful. Vincent's family was in a state of shock and panic, struggling to cope with the tragedy. His loved ones and friends held onto a sliver of hope that somehow he had managed to survive, despite the freezing water and strong current. Yet even they knew the odds were slim. Paradoxically, among all the concerned people, Angelika appeared the calmest. She continued to update her social media, posting photos and videos as if nothing had happened. This behavior deeply upset Vincent's family, who felt her actions were inappropriate and even suspicious. She claimed she was holding on to hope, waiting for her fiancé to return, but her words did not resonate with the grieving relatives. 10 days after Vincent's disappearance, Angelika found herself back at the police station for another round of questioning. It was all due to a seemingly offhand comment she had made during her initial conversation with detectives. She mentioned that she might have accidentally removed the drain plug from Vincent's kayak on the way back. This small detail drastically shifted the course of the investigation. Suddenly, there were more questions than answers, and the theory that Vincent's death was simply an accident started to seem less likely. In addition, Angelika told the detectives that Vincent's paddle was also damaged. It had lost a locking ring, which made it difficult to row properly. This only heightened the detectives' suspicions, leading them to consider the possibility of foul play. A broken paddle and a missing plug. These details troubled investigators. Combined, these small elements gave the police reason to suspect that Angelika may have intentionally set things up for Vincent to drown. But what would have driven her to do this? The motive remained a mystery, and without it, the entire picture felt incomplete. To shed light on her possible motives, investigators started reaching out to people who knew both Angelika and Vincent. The police contacted Angelika's ex-boyfriend, Michael Coven, whom she had lived with several years earlier. Michael was shocked when he learned about the suspicions surrounding Angelika, but admitted he couldn't completely rule out such an outcome. He revealed that beneath her calm and composed exterior was a darker side. During certain moments, particularly when they had been drinking, Angelika could become confrontational and start arguments, something Vincent, according to Michael, tolerated quietly. However, just a couple of weeks before the tragedy, Vincent confided to a friend that he was seriously questioning whether he should marry her. He described her as manipulative and aggressive, especially when she lost control. During questioning, Angelika admitted that there were indeed conflicts in the relationship, but claimed they were solely related to their personal life. Her ambiguous statements and vague language made the detectives suspicious. More and more details pointed to the possibility that Vincent's death was not an accident, but a carefully planned tragedy. The motive turned out to be more significant than initially expected. Beyond relationship issues and anger, Angelika had a specific financial incentive. She was the primary beneficiary of Vincent's life insurance policy, valued at approximately $500,000. It was a large sum that could solve her financial problems and offer her a fresh start. At the time, Angelika was unemployed, and this money could drastically change her future. These new revelations shifted Angelika from the role of grieving fiancé to the prime suspect. Despite this, she continued to insist on her innocence. However, the prosecution charged her with second-degree criminal wrongdoing, and she was detained with a bail set at $9 million, an amount she could hardly afford. Given her foreign nationality, investigators feared she might attempt to flee. So Angelika remained in custody awaiting trial. Angelika's defense argued that the statements she made during the 11-hour interrogation were not legally binding. Her attorney insisted that Vincent's body had still not been recovered, and that without forensic evidence, it was impossible to confirm any foul play or intentional wrongdoing. He argued that Vincent's death was a tragic accident. According to him, the kayak capsized due to a wave, and the drain plug might have come loose later when the vessel started sinking. To support their version of events, the defense organized an experiment on the Hudson River. A person with a similar build to Vincent sat in a kayak of the same model. The tests revealed that the vessel was sitting extremely low in the water, just a few inches above the surface, even on a calm day. This demonstrated that large waves could easily fill the kayak with water even if the plug hadn't been dislodged. Additionally, the attorney reminded everyone that Vincent had been under the influence of alcohol, which could have impaired his coordination and reaction time. A flooded kayak, questionable confessions, and experiments on the water, all of this sparked intense debate. Vincent's body was still missing, but the investigation was gaining momentum. The main point of contention was the drain plug, a tiny opening no bigger than a fingertip. It was hard to believe that such a small detail could have caused such a tragedy. The drain opening on Vincent's kayak was located on top, making it unlikely that it could have let in enough water to cause the vessel to sink. Doubts continued to grow, and Angelika's lawyer insisted on further experiments to shed light on this mystery. An exact simulation was conducted. The same type of kayak, a mannequin matching Vincent's weight and size, and conditions that closely mirrored those of that ill-fated day. The experiments showed that even with the drain plug removed, the kayak didn't fill with water quickly enough to cause it to capsize. The drain hole allowed only a small amount of water to trickle in, just drops that wouldn't have been enough to cause a fatal incident. This meant that even without the plug, Vincent's kayak could have easily made the remaining distance of about a mile or so back to shore. However, when the experiments seemed to completely disprove the theory about the plug, the prosecution shifted focus to the paddle. According to Angelika, the paddle was damaged, missing the locking ring, which investigators believed could have hindered Vincent's ability to control the kayak. But even here, the defense didn't back down. They demonstrated that the absence of the ring didn't affect the paddle's functionality. It remained sturdy, could be used effectively, and was fully operational. However, this didn't change the fact that during her interrogation, Angelika admitted to touching both Vincent's paddle and the plug, an admission that became the catalyst for the charges against her. To the police, all of this looked like a carefully planned crime. Even the smallest details, such as touching the paddle or accidentally brushing against the plug, were turned into grounds to suspect Angelika of deliberate actions. Yet despite the prosecution's seemingly logical narrative, the defense continued to fight. Angelika's attorney argued that her statements had been extracted under emotional duress during the interrogation. The defense brought in a false confessions expert who reviewed all 11 hours of the recorded questioning and concluded that the police had applied substantial psychological pressure. The expert claimed that the detectives used classic tactics designed to coerce a confession. They asked leading questions, played the roles of the good cop and the bad cop, didn't allow her time to process the situation, and pressured her into repeating phrases that suited their narrative. During the interrogation, Angelika often became confused. Her responses grew vague, and her emotions increasingly unstable. The expert argued that she was in a state of shock, and her words should have been treated with caution. One phrase that the detectives latched onto, her fleeting remark about having once thought about being free from the relationship, was interpreted as an admission of intent to harm Vincent. In reality, the defense claimed, this statement had no direct connection to the events of that day. It was merely a reference to their long-standing relationship issues. Angelika spoke about freedom in a broader sense, but the police chose to interpret her words differently. The interrogation expert noted that Angelika never used words like crime or even death in that context, and her admissions were more a result of manipulation by the investigators than the actual truth. The detectives, however, disregarded these details. Once they heard what they wanted, they dismissed any further statements Angelika made. The defense argued that Vincent's kayak had been having issues long before that fateful day. The drain plug had been faulty for months. According to Angelika, they had kayaked without the plug several times, and it never caused any serious problems. The conditions on the river that day were dangerous, but it was the weather, not any intentional actions, that led to the tragedy. Nevertheless, the prosecution remained firm in their stance. To them, it all fit together. A woman tired of the relationship, seeking financial gain, staging an accident to collect insurance money and gain freedom. Angelika's interrogation felt endless. She had lost track of time and felt cornered. At first, she tried to hold her ground, but when the police repeatedly circled back to the issue of the drain plug, her resolve weakened. Her story about the plug, whether it was there or not, became muddled, creating confusion that the investigators chose to exploit. The turning point came when a worn-down Angelika asked to leave so she could feed her cat at home. Tears welled up in her eyes, and that was the moment the detectives had been waiting for. They sensed her vulnerability and intensified the pressure. A barrage of leading questions came her way, and although she never directly confessed to a crime, the police refused to relent. An expert who later reviewed the interrogation footage noted that Angelika appeared exhausted, overwhelmed, and clearly not in a state to think clearly. Her inconsistent responses were the typical result of emotional fatigue, not a conscious admission of guilt. According to the expert, she simply wanted to escape the never-ending questioning, which led her to give several unclear answers that formed the basis of the case against her. Meanwhile, Vincent's body remained missing. His family and friends were left in limbo, with their pain growing each day. It wasn't until the morning of May 23, 2015, nearly a month after he had disappeared, that a boater finally discovered his body in the Hudson River, near the same Bannerman's Island the couple had visited on the day of the tragedy. The autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was drowning. There were no signs of foul play or struggle. Vincent's blood contained traces of alcohol, but not at a significant level, suggesting that he was mainly impacted by the harsh weather conditions and the frigid water temperature. Vincent's kayak was recovered a few days after the body was found. The drain plug was missing, and the paddle, as suspected, lacked the locking ring. Yet, the absence of the ring did not affect its functionality. The defense insisted that none of these factors alone could have led to drowning. It was the combination of circumstances: the cold water, strong winds, the lack of a life jacket, and the presence of alcohol. It was this combination that caused the tragedy, not any actions taken by Angelika. But the prosecution wasn't backing down. They focused on the inconsistencies in Angelika's statements, seeing them as evidence of her involvement in Vincent's death. Their theory was straightforward. She intentionally tampered with the kayak to create a situation where Vincent wouldn't survive. However, Angelika's lawyer insisted it was an unfortunate accident caused by Vincent's own recklessness. He chose to go out on the water while under the influence, without a life jacket, and in poor weather conditions. He knew the chances of surviving in the freezing water were slim, but he still took that risk. Despite Angelika maintaining her innocence, the case took a turn when the prosecution realized that pursuing a charge of intentional harm wouldn't hold. Pulling out a drain plug or breaking a paddle were complicated ways to commit a crime, and it wasn't enough to convince a jury. Furthermore, the defense's arguments were compelling, and experts confirmed that such a tragedy could indeed happen under those circumstances. At an impasse, the prosecution offered Angelika a plea deal. They proposed she plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, which would result in just a few years in prison instead of a life sentence. She agreed. Angelika was sentenced to 4 years of imprisonment for involuntary manslaughter. However, considering the time she had already served while awaiting trial, and during the court process, she had only a few months left to serve. Angelika was released on parole in December 2017, having spent 32 months in custody, less than 4 years. As part of the plea deal, she was technically sentenced to 4 years, but due to time served and early release, she ended up serving less than half that time. So, while her sentence was officially 4 years, the parole system allowed her to gain freedom earlier, in late 2017. Even after her release, tensions remained high. Vincent's family couldn't come to terms with the outcome. They believed Angelika was responsible for their son's death and were vocal about their dissatisfaction with the leniency of the sentence. Angelika, on the other hand, maintained that only she and God knew the truth. She continued to assert that she wasn't responsible for Vincent's death and that it had been a tragic accident. After her release, she faced new challenges. Deportation loomed, and she struggled to find employment. Angelika attempted to claim Vincent's insurance benefits, but her guilty plea made that impossible. 16 months later, she was forced to return to her home country, where she began to rebuild her life. Leaving the nightmare of those events behind, she enrolled in a university, found a job, and continued to move forward, claiming she had fully recovered from the ordeal. Folks, there are a lot of questions in this story that we might never get clear answers to. Vincent's death, Angelika's behavior, and the conflicting testimonies. All of these create a complex and emotionally charged picture. It's easy to get swayed by public opinion or the prosecution's narrative in such situations, but it's important to remember, the truth isn't always obvious. Personally, I believe that the justice system, especially in cases like this, can make mistakes. Interrogation tactics, pressure, and psychological exhaustion, these can all lead to false confessions. Angelika found herself in a situation where not only the circumstances but also her own missteps in words and actions worked against her. But was she truly responsible for Vincent's death? Or was it just a tragic accident that spiraled into a nightmare for everyone involved? Now, I want to turn to you, the viewers. What do you think weighs heavier in this story, guilt or chance? Is Angelika a victim of a judicial error? Or is she truly connected to Vincent's death? What would you have done in her place? And most importantly, can we always trust conclusions drawn from conflicting evidence? I'm eager to hear your thoughts. This is the kind of story that makes you question the fine line between truth and accusation. Sometimes one person's life can trigger a chain of irreversible events that end up destroying entire families. The line between sorrow and hatred is often so thin that once you cross it, there's no going back. In a small village, when the quiet hides a storm of human emotions, unseen threads of jealousy, betrayal, and revenge can tie people up, pushing them to act in the dark. This story is about how intense emotions can tear apart not only lives, but even the closest relationships. The question is, who's ready to pay the price for unbearable grief, and what will it cost those left behind? The cry of a baby shattered the silence of the night as a man, drenched in sweat from fear, rushed up to the second floor of his house. He had no idea what was waiting for him, but his heart was pounding. In the bedroom, he was met with a horrifying scene. His wife, Maiva, was lying face down on the floor, covered in blood. Next to her, under her arm, was their son, crying uncontrollably. The man was frozen with terror and confusion. What could have happened? Just a few hours earlier, everything seemed normal. His shift at the restaurant had ended late. It was a wedding party, and he'd already told his wife he'd be home later than usual. They had been texting back and forth all evening, but around midnight, Maiva's messages stopped. He figured she had just fallen asleep, exhausted. There was nothing to worry about. The house was quiet when he got home at 12:49 a.m., and although the door was unlocked, he didn't think much of it. The only unusual thing was the silence and the TV being off. And now, standing in front of this terrifying scene, he couldn't make sense of it. Maybe she had fallen and hurt herself? He dialed 911, unsure of what to do. The operator gave him instructions on how to perform CPR, and he started giving his wife chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth. But as he worked, it slowly dawned on him that she was already gone. The paramedics arrived around 3 a.m. and officially declared her dead. Their son was unharmed, but what exactly caused Maiva's death was still a mystery. The investigators who arrived at the young family's home couldn't have predicted the grim reality of what had happened. Blood spattered across the walls, and even the ceiling pointed to a brutal struggle. But they quickly realized this wasn't just a typical case of domestic violence or an accidental fall. The woman's skull was almost completely crushed, and her body showed signs of multiple blows. Bruises on her hands and back indicated that she had fought hard to protect herself and her son during the attack. By around 2:48 a.m., emergency responders were already on the scene, but by then, it was clear. This was a cold-blooded murder. The medical examiner later confirmed the brutality of the attack. She had been hit with extreme violence, but there was no evidence of sexual assault. And although at first it seemed like it could have been a robbery, that theory fell apart when Maiva's purse, along with her personal belongings and money, was found the next morning near a pond close to the restaurant. All the evidence pointed to Maiva being the target. The only question left was, who could commit such a vicious crime? The police started digging into the family's past. At first glance, Maiva and her husband Alain seemed to have a peaceful life. They had known each other since childhood, grew up in the same village, and went to the same school. Their life appeared to be full of happiness. Soon after their wedding, they found out they were expecting a child, and their son Lorenzo was born a year later. The family moved into a small house, and Maiva had plans to open a nail salon. They had even picked out a bigger house for the business, but just 3 weeks before the move, everything changed. Maiva's death was so unexpected that her loved ones couldn't believe it. And even though their life seemed perfect on the surface, the investigation uncovered dark secrets within the family. It turned out that Alain was involved in illegal activities related to drug dealing. He had run-ins with the law, and while Maiva was aware of this, she was strongly against his involvement in anything like that. After Alain's arrest, she even turned down an offer to buy a car for 100,000 euros, earned through his shady operations, saying she didn't want dirty money. Her frustration extended to all of Alain's friends who came by for business deals. Maiva wouldn't let him meet with them, which annoyed some of his acquaintances. Some of these people, including old school friends, weren't happy with Maiva's interference, which led to conflicts. Maiva's relatives believed these connections might have led to her murder. They thought Alain owed someone a large sum of money, and the crime was meant to send a message. However, Alain insisted that no one in his circle would be capable of such a crime. He immediately told the police about all his contacts and business dealings, assuring them he had no outstanding debts or serious conflicts. Moreover, the police quickly ruled out the possibility of a criminal dispute. The house where Maiva was killed was in perfect order. Nothing had been stolen except for that one purse, and as it turned out, nothing had been taken from it either. But the investigation took a new turn. The police discovered that 6 months before the crime, Maiva and her husband had been receiving threats from an elderly couple in a neighboring village. The threats stemmed from a conflict involving Maiva's father's best friend. Investigators started tracking down where this couple was on the night of the murder. The small village was shocked as the horrifying details of the crime came to light. No one could believe that the man who regularly visited Maiva's father and supported him through tough times turned out to be guilty. It all began with two witnesses who noticed strange behavior that night, and their testimony was the key to cracking the case. The first witness, a young doctor, was out for a late-night walk with his baby in a stroller when he saw a man wearing pink rubber gloves. The man was clearly trying to avoid being seen, and when he noticed the doctor, he quickly turned away. The doctor remembered his odd behavior and even recalled part of the license plate number from the car he saw nearby. The second witness, who was driving home with his wife, also recognized this man. He reported seeing Rue Berrois slowly driving down the street, carefully looking around. It seemed suspicious, so the man decided to alert the police. The investigators didn't waste any time. They tapped the Berrois family's phone. This move paid off. During one conversation, Rue Berrois' wife, Enda, unintentionally gave her husband away. She was talking to a friend, telling her how that night her husband had come home with Maiva's purse, the same one that went missing on the day of the crime. He showed it to her and coldly said, "See, I did it." The police immediately arrested the couple, and soon after, Rue Berrois confessed. Rue Berrois had lost his son, Rudolph, a few months before, and he couldn't cope with the grief. On that fateful night, he first had dinner at a friend's house and then went to the cemetery to tend to his son's grave. He took the gloves and shoes he usually used for cemetery work. After leaving the grave, he was overcome with rage. He got into his car and drove to Alain and Maiva's house. With a baseball bat that he always kept in his car, he easily got into the house. The door wasn't locked. When Rue went up to the second floor where Maiva and her son were sleeping, Maiva woke up. She recognized him right away, but before she could say or do anything, Rue hit her multiple times with the bat. He later reenacted the entire crime during a police investigation. After the murder, he grabbed Maiva's purse, walked out of the house, and went home. Once there, he showed the purse to his wife and then got rid of it. The next day, he burned the baseball bat in the fireplace. When the villagers found out that Rue Berrois was the killer, their shock was beyond words. They couldn't believe that the man who had been supporting Maiva's father, asking about the police investigation and constantly inquiring about any new findings, was the same person who committed the crime. He even asked if they had found her purse or discovered any clues at the crime scene. So why did Berrois commit such a brutal act? It all tied back to his son, Rudolph. 8 months before the murder, on August 21, 2011, Rudolph was in a car accident while speeding toward Alain and Maiva's house to have it out with them. On the way, he lost control of the car, skidded off the road, and died just minutes after the crash. Rue blamed Alain and Maiva for his son's death, and his anger grew by the day. Every morning, Enda Berrois, Rue's wife, would light candles at an altar dedicated to her son. Their house was filled with photos of Rudolph, surrounded by somber symbols of loss, and quiet conversations with his spirit became part of her daily routine. She was convinced that his death wasn't just a tragic accident, and she searched for answers every day. On the night Rudolph died in the crash, something shifted in her mind. Her heart was consumed with hatred and a thirst for revenge. Since then, Enda couldn't stay calm. She didn't believe the official story, nor did she trust the investigators or the forensic experts who said her son had simply lost control of the car. The fact that Rudolph's body was found outside the car and the seatbelt marks didn't match his position in the vehicle made her think that someone else had been driving. Nothing could convince her that Rudolph died by accident. Despite all the forensic reports, including DNA tests and phone records, Enda was certain her son was murdered. She collected evidence, took photos of anything related to the tragedy, and was determined to find the person responsible. Even months after the accident, she made her husband drill a hole into Rudolph's grave, hoping to record his voice with a tape recorder and get answers from the other side. But gradually, her hatred became focused on two people, Alain and Maiva. In Enda's mind, she formed a dark theory that they were responsible for her son's death. Her hatred for Maiva grew even stronger as more details about their relationship came to light. Many years ago, when Maiva and Rudolph were teenagers, they dated, and to everyone else it seemed like a typical teenage romance. But for Maiva, he was her first real love. She was deeply in love with Rudolph in her younger years, but over time, she realized he wasn't the kind of person she could build a life with. His cheating and constant drama ruined their relationship, and by 2009, Maiva decided to end things with him. She found comfort and support in Alain, who soon became her fiancé. However, Rudolph couldn't handle the fact that Maiva had moved on. Even after she got pregnant, he wouldn't leave her alone. Maiva told her mom that one time Rudolph tried to kiss her on a bridge, but she pushed him away. Soon after, Maiva gave birth, but that didn't stop Rudolph. His obsessive behavior continued, and he kept texting her, begging to start over. Seeing that Rudolph wouldn't back off, Alain decided to step in. He met with Rudolph and warned him that he wouldn't tolerate the harassment any longer, but even after that, Rudolph kept sending messages. So Alain took those messages and showed them to Crystal, Rudolph's girlfriend at the time. That ended their relationship. Crystal broke up with Rudolph after finding out he was still obsessed with his ex. This loss pushed Rudolph over the edge. On that fateful night, he got drunk at a bar and, grabbing a hammer, decided to drive over to Alain's house. He was determined to confront him. People at the bar saw him and felt like something bad was about to happen. When police cars and ambulances sped by shortly after, many already guessed what had gone down. Rudolph never made it to Alain's house. His car veered off the road at a curve, and he died at the scene, despite the paramedics' attempts to save him. His death was a shock to everyone, but it hit his mother the hardest. From that moment on, she dedicated her life to finding someone to blame. Enda blamed Maiva for her son's death. She would show up at her house and threaten her, saying that Maiva would pay for her son being in the grave. Scared, Maiva filed a police report detailing how Rudolph's mother had threatened to kill her. This report was supposed to ease the tension, but it only made things worse. Every day, Enda told her husband that Maiva was to blame for their loss and that he needed to do something about it. In the end, Rouberrois started to believe that it was his destiny to avenge his son's death. 2 months before the tragedy, he showed up at Maiva and Alain's house with threats and accusations. Staring down at Maiva, he said she was responsible for his son Rudolph's death and that he wouldn't stop until he got his revenge. He mentioned his connections and money, adding insults that only escalated the tension in the family. This warning was a dark omen of the horror that would unfold later. 8 months after Rudolph's death, Beroy moved from words to actions. He broke into Alain and Maiva's home when she was the only one there, asleep next to their young son, Lorenzo. In that fatal moment, she found herself trapped, face to face with a man consumed by rage, which had completely overtaken his ability to think clearly. This uncontrollable fury ended in a horrific outcome. Investigators were still working to determine what role his wife, Enda Beroy, had played in the crime. Though Enda claimed she had nothing to do with the murder, she was involved in its aftermath. When Rue came home after what he'd done, she told him to get rid of Maiva's purse, the one piece of evidence that could have shed light on what happened that night. In her testimony, Enda denied knowing about her husband's plans. She said he had completely lost his mind and acted on his own. She insisted to investigators that she had never asked him to do anything and didn't know he had committed the crime because of her. Still, despite her claims, suspicions of her involvement lingered. Her behavior during the trial spoke volumes. Enda seemed more concerned about her own fate, nervously glancing at the lawyers, reporters, and judges. She was more worried about the possibility of getting a 3-year prison sentence than the fact that her husband was facing life behind bars. On the witness stand, she showed no remorse for what had happened, focusing only on avoiding jail time herself. During the trial, Rue Berrois didn't admit to planning the murder in advance. The issue of whether his wife had provoked him never came up in court, but many believed Enda played a part in the crime. She had manipulated her husband, constantly pressuring him to believe that he needed to act, something he might never have done on his own. Even in the courtroom, she cast cold, controlling glances at him, as if still trying to direct his testimony. In the end, Rue Berrois was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder of Maiva. His wife, Enda, received a 2-year sentence for ordering the destruction of Maiva's purse, a key piece of evidence. Maiva's relatives felt the punishment was too light, especially for Enda, whom they saw as the manipulator who pushed her husband to commit the crime. However, neither Rue nor Enda appealed the sentences. After Maiva's death, their son Lorenzo was left alone. At first, he was cared for by a child psychologist to help him cope with the loss of his mother. Eventually, Lorenzo went to live with other relatives, and his life slowly began to stabilize. There's little known about what happened to Alain. What remains in the hearts of those who knew Maiva are the photos and videos of a woman whose life was brutally cut short by hatred and revenge aimed at her family. This story is a powerful example of how hate, grief, and the inability to cope with loss can destroy not just one life, but entire families. The tragedy began with the death of Rudolph, who was a victim of his own recklessness, but for his parents, it was an unbearable loss. Enda Berrois's obsession with revenge led to even greater harm, as she manipulated her husband, feeding off his pain, and ultimately drove him to commit a horrific crime. Maiva and her son Lorenzo became innocent victims of destructive emotions that no one could control. While Rue Berrois was responsible for his actions, he was driven by guilt and hatred, skillfully fueled by his wife. This tragedy highlights how important it is to manage grief before it turns into a desire for revenge. In the end, neither revenge nor punishment brought peace to anyone involved in this drama. One family lost a daughter, mother, and wife, while another lost a son. It's a heartbreaking and painful story. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Sometimes, till death do us part doesn't last long at all. Sweet, tender feelings can quickly turn into frustration, disappointment, and even outright hatred. In those cases, the most reasonable thing to do is end the relationship, if not as friends, then at least not as enemies. But when large sums of money and the chance to get rich fast enter the picture at the cost of an ex-lover's life, an unsuspecting person's fate could be sealed. Gary Bentley's case is hardly unique. People have been killed for far less, but in this instance, the killer was hoping to pocket $1 million and secure a life of ease and comfort. Did Gary himself sense what might happen? His parents think he did. They had a bad feeling and were worried about him, trying to protect him. But Gary couldn't fully believe that the love of his life, the mother of his child, was actually capable of murder. He fought hard to save his crumbling marriage for the sake of his son, but in the end, he ended up in the grave, and the boy was left an orphan, even though his mother was still alive. So, what do we know about Gary Bentley and his early life? Gary Louis Bentley was born on August 31st, 1984, in a small rural town called Louisville, located in Jefferson County, Kentucky. He was the youngest of 2 kids born to Gerald and Lisa Bentley. Gary grew up with his older sister Amy, and they had a close, trusting relationship from an early age. The Bentley family ran their own farm and worked hard to make sure their kids had everything they needed, including a good education. The kids pitched in too, and didn't shy away from the hard physical work that came with running a farm. The whole family was tight-knit, caring for each other and always offering support. From a young age, Gary spent a lot of time with his dad, Gerald. They were very close, often going fishing, hunting, and camping together. His dad taught him how to handle a gun, shared survival skills like how to navigate the wilderness, and showed him where to find edible mushrooms and berries. As a teenager, Gary developed a serious interest in firearms. He knew how to handle them and eventually started collecting guns. Nearly every weekend, he and his dad would go hunting or fishing, and they were best friends. Gary was the definition of a small-town guy, a real handyman who could build or fix just about anything. People around him would describe him as kind-hearted, easygoing, and always willing to help anyone in need. Gary did well in school, stayed away from bad influences, didn't have any bad habits, and never got into trouble with the law. He was a quiet, homebody type of kid who always put his family first. After high school, Gary went to college in the state capital, Frankfurt, where he majored in engineering. After graduating, he moved back to his hometown of Louisville, starting out as a basic electrician, but he quickly worked his way up the ladder. The one and only love. While in college, Gary met a girl named Tasha, who became the love of his life. She was about a year and a half older than him, but the small age gap didn't bother them at all. They started dating pretty quickly and in 2006 moved in together, settling not far from Gary's parents' home. Tasha was studying to be a nurse and, after getting her degree, landed a job at one of the city's hospitals, where she quickly earned the respect and admiration of her co-workers. She didn't stop there, though. She decided to continue her education and kept working to advance her career. In 2012, Gary and Tasha finally made it official, throwing a big wedding and inviting all their family and friends. Soon after, Tasha got pregnant, and the couple was overjoyed. In the spring of 2013, they welcomed a baby boy and named him Connor. By the time their first child was born, both Gary and Tasha's careers were thriving. They were making good money and were able to move into a bigger, more comfortable home, buy 2 cars, travel, and basically live without worrying about money. Gary dreamed of having a big family and wanted at least 2 more kids with Tasha, but things started to fall apart just a few years later. What was Tasha hiding? The first 4 years of their marriage were perfect. People saw them as a model couple. They had respected, well-paying jobs, were amazing parents, good friends, and gracious hosts. The couple often threw parties at their home, inviting family and close friends. They were always the first to step up if someone needed help or support. Gary's parents, Gerald and Lisa, couldn't have been happier with their daughter-in-law and grandson. But in 2016, things started to change rapidly. The Bentley marriage hit a rough patch, and their relationship began to deteriorate. It all started when Tasha began having problems at work, something that had never happened before. She constantly complained about her coworkers, her boss, and the unbearable working conditions. Gary did his best to support her, but he advised her not to quit too quickly, since finding another job with a good salary wouldn't be easy. In the fall of 2016, trying to take a break and relieve some stress, the couple decided to go on vacation. They left their son with Gary's parents and flew to a resort. They went to Jamaica with their longtime friends, Annie and Kevin Day, who they had been close with for years. The first few days of the trip were perfect. They all had fun, relaxed on the beach, explored the island, and enjoyed each other's company. But Tasha seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. She was constantly texting someone and got very defensive if anyone asked her who she was talking to. The longer they stayed on the island, the more Gary and Tasha started arguing. According to their friends, the fights seemed to come out of nowhere and quickly escalated into full-blown arguments, which made Annie and Kevin uncomfortable. One day, during a yacht trip, Gary and Tasha got into yet another argument, and to ease the tension, Kevin tried to make a joke. In response, Gary splashed beer in his face. Kevin didn't take it too personally, understanding that Gary's reaction wasn't really about the joke, but more about the stress caused by Tasha. Gary, feeling embarrassed afterward, apologized several times, admitting he didn't know what came over him. The new job. Shortly after they returned home from vacation, Tasha told Gary she had quit her job. Gary wasn't happy about her decision since losing such a good income could hurt their family's financial situation. However, being a responsible and frugal person, he had some savings that could help them get by and maintain their lifestyle until she found another job. But just a day after quitting, Tasha was hired as a consultant at a big pharmaceutical company. This was odd because she hadn't mentioned finding a job before quitting. It seemed like someone might have helped her land the position, but Tasha brushed it off as pure luck, saying she stumbled across the interview by chance. Although Tasha seemed happy with her new job, things didn't get better at home. She was rarely around, stopped cooking, didn't take care of the house, and showed little interest in what was going on with Gary. She even neglected their son, leaving most of the parenting to his grandparents. On the weekends, Mrs. Bentley started leaving town, saying she had work trips. She was constantly on the phone with someone, always finding a private spot so no one could overhear the conversation. When asked, she insisted it was work-related and that she needed to discuss things with her colleagues or bosses. She also put a password on her phone, something she had never done before, so no one could check it. She became secretive and distant. Gary, on the other hand, was the one taking care of their son, pouring all his love and attention into him. He practically lived for the boy, spending all his free time with him and doing everything possible to make sure he didn't feel neglected. Despite the constant fights and his wife's indifference, Gary still loved her and hoped to save their marriage, if only for their child's sake. Family trip to Mexico. Gary's parents, seeing the tension building in their son's family, decided to surprise him, Tasha, and their grandson with a trip to one of the most beautiful resorts in Mexico. They chose a cozy hotel in a secluded area, hoping it would give them a peaceful environment to reconnect and spend quality time together. There wasn't much cell service there, and the internet was weak and often cut out. This allowed the family to enjoy each other's company, hang out at the beach, and take long walks. However, Tasha was visibly frustrated by the lack of connectivity. She was always trying to make phone calls or find a signal to send messages. She got angry, lashing out at Gary and his parents, even yelling at their young son. Gary's dad, Gerald, found her behavior strange and decided to have an honest talk with his son. He shared his suspicion that Tasha might be having an affair. Gary tried to laugh it off, but from the look in his eyes, Gerald could tell his son had the same thoughts, but was trying to pretend everything was fine. The couple argued every day, and Tasha demanded they cut the vacation short and return home, citing some urgent work matters. Eventually, she packed her bags and announced she would fly back alone. This forced the rest of the family to leave early with her, even though their stay at the hotel was paid for another week, and they didn't get any refunds. A strange string of fires. In the spring of 2017, Tasha called her father-in-law, Gerald, sounding distressed. She asked him to come help her and pick her up. She explained that her car had caught fire at a gas station and was completely destroyed. She needed to go to her insurance company and then head back home. Of course, Gerald rushed to help her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. This was the third time in the years she had been with Gary that one of her cars had mysteriously burned up. Each time it happened at a gas station, and the car was reduced to nothing but scrap metal, making it impossible to determine the real cause of the fire. Every time, the incidents were blamed on faulty gas station equipment, and Tasha always received hefty insurance payouts. These fires happened about every 3 years, and Tasha would insure the cars for the maximum amount just before the fires occurred, always using different insurance companies. She claimed to have no idea how it happened, and some friends and family even thought she might have enemies who were purposely sabotaging her cars. Still, after each accident, Tasha bought a newer, more expensive car. The insurance companies had no grounds to deny her claims, even though the fires followed a suspicious pattern. Proving deliberate property damage was next to impossible. The not-so-secret affair. By the summer of 2017, Tasha was disappearing almost every weekend, explaining it as work trips. She became more distant from Gary and their son, living what seemed like a separate life. Friends, family, and even the Bentleys' neighbors began to suspect that Tasha was having an affair. These rumors hit Gary hard. He stopped trying to joke about it and would either stay quiet or quickly change the subject. Gary's parents tried several times to talk to him, telling him that things couldn't go on like this since, essentially, the marriage had already fallen apart. But Gary always responded the same way. He still loved his wife and was determined to keep the family together for Connor's sake. He held on to the hope that Tasha would come to her senses, reconsider her priorities, and that things would go back to the way they were. In November 2017, Gary, Tasha, and their son went to his parents' house to celebrate Thanksgiving. Gary's sister, Amy, also came with her family. When everyone started exchanging gifts, it turned out that Tasha hadn't bought any, saying she was too busy with work. She apologized and left, promising to fix it and return soon. She was gone for hours, but came back empty-handed, without buying anything, not even for her son. When everyone gave her confused looks, she claimed the lines everywhere were too long, and it would have taken her all night to get through them. This time, Amy couldn't hold back. She pulled Gary aside and asked him point-blank if he realized that Tasha was probably seeing someone else and wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Gary simply responded that they would handle it themselves. A gun safe in the bedroom. The following weekend, Gary called his dad and asked him to come over and bring some tools. Gerald was happy to help and showed up at his son's house within half an hour with everything needed. As mentioned earlier, Gary had been collecting guns since his youth, and his house was filled with pistols, hunting rifles, shotguns, and more. He even had some rare items scattered across different rooms. But now, Gary suddenly decided to install a safe in his house, gather up all his firearms, and lock them away. This sudden decision worried Gerald a little, so he asked Gary why he suddenly wanted to hide his gun collection. Gary didn't give a clear answer, but Gerald could tell his son was afraid of something, and it didn't seem like he was worried about burglars. Later, when Tasha got home, she explained that it was her idea because she was scared and felt like they might be in danger. Her words seemed strange, but at the time, Gerald didn't think much of it. Only a few days remained before the tragedy. The mysterious murder at home. On Sunday, December 10th, 2017, Tasha called her father-in-law, telling him she hadn't been able to reach Gary all day, and when she got home, the garage door was open. She was too scared to go inside, worried that burglars might have broken in, and asked Gerald to come over. Thankfully, Connor was safe, staying with his grandparents, and Gary was home alone. Gerald rushed over as fast as he could. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The garage door was indeed ajar, but there were no signs of forced entry. Inside the house, everything looked normal. Nothing appeared to be missing, and there were no indications of an intruder. Gerald called out to his son several times, but there was no response. When he walked into the bedroom, he found Gary's lifeless body lying on the bed. In shock, Gerald tried to perform CPR, but Gary's body was already cold, showing signs of rigor mortis. He immediately called 911, still unable to believe his son was gone. It wasn't until later that he noticed the gun safe in the bedroom had been broken into and some of the firearms were missing. The forensic findings. When the forensic team arrived, they determined that Gary had been killed by a single gunshot to the head, fired at close range. Since he was lying on his side in bed in a sleeping position and had no other injuries or signs of a struggle, it was likely that he was asleep and didn't even hear the killer approach. The crime didn't look like a typical robbery. Valuables, a jewelry box, and even cash left in plain sight were untouched. This indicated that the main target was the gun safe. However, only a few guns were taken, none of which were particularly valuable. Neither these nor the guns that remained were the murder weapon. The main suspect. From the start of the investigation, Gary's wife, Tasha, was the primary suspect. For one, she didn't seem like a grieving widow. She calmly spoke with the detectives, detailing the day's events leading up to when she and her father-in-law found the body. Second, all of the couple's friends and family confirmed that Gary and Tasha's marriage had been on the rocks for a while, and they were close to divorce. Third, the Bentleys had 2 large dogs that barked at anyone but their owners, yet the neighbors hadn't heard any barking, and Gary would have likely woken up from the noise if they had. Tasha claimed that Gary had planned to go hunting that day, and she had left the house to run some errands. She said that she'd tried to call him after lunch, but she hadn't been able to get through. Not too concerned, she chalked it up to bad reception. On her way home, she stopped by a friend's house, which her friends confirmed when questioned. There were no witnesses to the crime. No one heard anything suspicious or saw any strangers that day. Even surveillance footage from nearby cameras yielded no useful clues. The crime appears to have been a carefully planned crime, unsuccessfully staged as a robbery. A $1 million insurance policy. Annie Day, one of Tasha's friends, called her to offer her condolences and ask if she could help with funeral arrangements. Tasha's response stunned Annie. She said that Gary's parents were handling the funeral because she had more important things to take care of. Those more important things turned out to be a trip to the insurance company for a large payout. Apparently, shortly before the murder, Tasha had convinced Gary to take out a $1 million life insurance policy. Gary, in an effort to please his wife, agreed, although he wasn't thrilled about it. A few days before the crime, Tasha tried to increase the payout to $2 million, but she failed. Now there was a clear motive. However, there was still no hard evidence linking Tasha to the murder. At the same time, details surfaced about her 3 previous burned-out cars, each of which had resulted in large insurance payouts. It became clear that Tasha had pulled similar insurance tricks before. Lover or accomplice? One of Tasha's friends said that Tasha had been dating a co-worker named Anthony for over a year, and he was the one who helped her get a new job. Investigators decided to question Anthony about his involvement in the crime, suspecting that he may have helped his lover. Anthony admitted that he had a long-standing romantic relationship with Tasha and revealed that they met regularly at his home. He claimed that Tasha was planning to leave Gary, and they even planned to celebrate New Year's Eve 2018 together. When Anthony realized that he was being considered as a suspect in the murder investigation, he rushed to provide an alibi. He stated that on the day of the murder, he was at his parents' house helping them with renovations. They made several trips to thrift stores that day, all of which were captured on surveillance cameras. Detectives concluded that Tasha had likely acted alone, which explained why there were no signs of a break-in and why the dogs hadn't barked. But the murder weapon and the missing guns from the safe remained a mystery. Tasha's version of events. Tasha kept changing her story, adding new details, and sometimes trying to shift the blame onto others. She even brought up the conflict between Gary and Kevin Day during their vacation, when Gary threw beer in his friend's face. According to Tasha, Kevin might have held a grudge and used this as an opportunity for revenge. However, a few hours into her interrogation, Tasha finally cracked and confessed. She admitted to killing her husband, but blamed Gary for what happened. Tasha claimed that Gary was abusive, both to her and their son, and that on the day of the murder, he had once again hit their child. She said that was the last straw, and after waiting for Gary to fall asleep, she grabbed a gun. However, none of Tasha's claims were backed up. None of Tasha's friends or family supported her claims. In fact, everyone stood by Gary, saying he was a devoted, loving husband and the most caring father they had ever known. They insisted he would never lay a hand on his wife, let alone their young son, whom he adored. Even the child confirmed that his dad had never hurt him or his mom. Tasha eventually revealed the hiding spot where she had stashed the guns taken from the safe, including the murder weapon, a pistol. Interestingly, the gun had Anthony's fingerprints on it. As it turned out, Tasha had given the gun to her lover to hold, leaving his prints behind. Her plan was to frame him if things didn't go as expected, but she confessed before she could put that part of the plan into action. Trial and sentencing. The trial for Gary's murder began in June 2021. According to the prosecution, the primary motive for the crime was money. Tasha hoped to collect the $1 million insurance payout and planned to use part of that money to renovate Anthony's house, where she intended to move in the near future. On July 20th, 2021, Tasha Bentley was found guilty of premeditated murder and attempting to mislead the investigation. She was sentenced to 55 years in prison, with the possibility of parole no earlier than 2037. As for little Connor, who lost both his father and mother in one tragic moment, he is now being raised by his paternal grandparents. This crime was featured on an episode of Investigation Discovery titled American Monster. A lot of people enjoy traveling solo without worrying that something bad could happen. The main perks are the total freedom to do whatever you want, the ability to quickly adjust plans, and the rare chance to spend time alone with your own thoughts and feelings. However, alongside these benefits, there are also plenty of risks, especially for women who decide to take solo trips. The tragic story of Maria Luisa Cedeño, which happened in 2020 in Costa Rica, shocked the entire country and later made headlines internationally. The case drew widespread attention because it occurred at an expensive hotel in a popular resort area, and the victim was a well-known doctor who headed the anesthesiology department at one of the country's largest medical centers. Who was Maria Luisa Cedeño? Maria Luisa Cedeño was born on May 29, 1977, in La Fortuna, San Carlos, in the province of Alajuela, Costa Rica. She was the youngest of 5 children in a modest family. Her relatives were all simple workers with no education beyond what they got in school. From a young age, Maria Luisa was ambitious and very determined. She wanted to help others and dreamed of becoming a doctor, promising herself she'd be the first in her family to get a college degree. In school, her favorite subjects were chemistry and biology, and after graduating in 1994, she was accepted into the medical school at the most prestigious university in the country, located in San Jose. As a student, Maria Luisa moved to the capital and stayed there for the rest of her life, though she kept close ties with her family, regularly visiting and staying in touch with them. In 2000, after completing her degree, she started working as an anesthesiologist at one of the largest medical centers in the capital. She quickly advanced in her career, constantly learning and improving her skills. By 2015, Cedeño had become the head of the anesthesiology and recovery therapy department. She was loved and respected by her colleagues and became quite a prominent doctor, though she achieved all this by sacrificing her personal life. For a long time, Maria Luisa was alone and completely devoted to her work. In 2017, when she was 40, she started a romantic relationship with a doctor from the same hospital, although he worked in a different department. She believed he was the love of her life, someone she could build a strong and happy family with. However, at the beginning of 2020, the couple broke up because he started seeing a younger colleague. For Maria Luisa, the breakup was a devastating blow. She fell into a deep depression and buried herself in work for months, barely noticing anything around her. Her only comfort was her little dog, Mofalti, who she treated like her child. The last vacation. In July 2020, Maria Luisa decided she desperately needed a break and a change of scenery before she lost her mind. At the time, the COVID-19 pandemic was spreading worldwide, and various restrictions were in place to slow the virus. She chose to head to the coast and stay at a small but cozy hotel called Le Mansion Inn, located in the scenic Punta Arenas. This resort is usually popular with tourists from all over the world, but with the pandemic and strict lockdowns, it was almost deserted. At the hotel where she checked in, only a few rooms were occupied. However, the peace and quiet were exactly what she was looking for. Maria Luisa planned to spend the weekend there and head home on Monday. She brought along her beloved dog, Mofalti. She stayed in a ground-floor room that had a second door leading to a private courtyard. These rooms were designed for travelers with pets so that the animals could go outside and take care of their business in a designated area. All the other rooms with courtyard access were empty at the time. On July 18th, Maria Luisa checked in, dropped off her things, and headed to the beach. The next day passed just as quietly. She strolled along the shore, sunbathed, had dinner at the restaurant, and then went back to her room. She called her mother, and they talked for about half an hour. Maria Luisa mentioned how empty the hotel was, with only a few staff members, most of whom were juggling multiple jobs. She planned to check out the next morning after breakfast, but she never made it that far. A lifeless body wrapped in a sheet. On the morning of July 20th, Maria Luisa didn't show up for breakfast. The hotel staff noticed this because there were so few guests, but they didn't think much of it, assuming she was just sleeping in before heading home. But when checkout time came and she still hadn't appeared, they decided to check her room. 2 staff members knocked on Maria Luisa's door, but there was no answer. They could hear her dog barking inside, so they knew she had to be there. They kept knocking and calling her name, but the only response was the barking. So they went around to the courtyard to see if they could reach her that way. The second door was unlocked, and the staff decided to enter to make sure everything was okay. As soon as they stepped inside, they noticed brownish stains on the floor that looked like dried blood, and on the bed, they found a body wrapped in a sheet. The hotel staff immediately called emergency services and informed the management. Unfortunately, the paramedics could only confirm that Maria Luisa was dead. She had been killed several hours before her body was found. Everything about the scene was strange, from the condition of the room to the circumstances of her death. The investigation begins. Maria Luisa's body showed multiple cuts, bruises, and bite marks left by different people. Defensive wounds on her hands indicated that she had fought back fiercely. The cause of death was mechanical asphyxia and a broken neck. Someone had strangled her so hard that they broke her cervical vertebrae. The autopsy also revealed that she had been sexually assaulted before she died. Next to her bed, there was a bottle of mineral water, an open bottle of expensive wine, and 2 glasses. According to the maid, Maria Luisa had indeed ordered these items the night before, but she had been alone. The records of her key card showed that after receiving her delivery, she didn't leave the room, and no one entered. However, the glass door to the courtyard didn't require a key, so the attacker could have gotten in that way. The hotel had plenty of security cameras, which might have shed some light on what happened. But it turned out none of them had been working for months. The administration claimed that due to the pandemic and the drop in guests, they had cut costs by shutting off the cameras. Forensic experts tested the bite marks on Maria Luisa's body for DNA, hoping to find the killer's saliva, but the results were shocking. The saliva found in the wounds was her own. Because the bite marks were on her face, neck, and chest, where she could not physically reach, investigators concluded that the perpetrator intentionally stained the wounds with her saliva to cover his tracks. Another surprising detail came from the pathologist who reported that her body had been thoroughly washed after death. This meant that after she was attacked, tortured, and strangled, the perpetrator or perpetrators took her body to the bathroom, washed her, then laid her on the bed, stained the bite marks with her saliva, and wrapped her in a sheet. Since the hotel's cameras weren't working and the place was almost empty due to the pandemic, no witnesses were found. None of the guests or staff reported seeing or hearing anything unusual, and no strangers were spotted on the property. The first suspect. News of the brutal murder of a well-known anesthesiologist quickly spread across the country, causing a huge public outcry. The police needed to solve the case as soon as possible and figure out who could have been so cruel to an innocent woman. When the victim's family was asked if she could have had a brief vacation fling, they were sure the answer was no. She was still heartbroken over her recent breakup and hoping for reconciliation. As for the 2 glasses found in the room, Maria Luisa's sister explained that she always used 2, one for wine and one for water. The forensic results confirmed this, as only the victim's fingerprints and lip marks were found on the glasses. During the interview with the police, Maria Luisa's mother suddenly recalled that during her last phone call with her daughter, Maria had mentioned a man who worked at the hotel. She said they had chatted during lunch, and he asked her why she was traveling alone and how long she planned to stay. This gave detectives their first suspect to question. That employee was 38-year-old Teodor Herrera Martinez, the son of a longtime friend of the hotel owner, Harry Bowden. In fact, thanks to his father's connections, Martinez had gotten the job at the hotel. He worked as a bartender and did personal errands for his boss. Right from the start of the interview, Martinez acted strange, very nervous, and claimed he didn't remember Maria Luisa or ever talking to her. Fresh scratches were clearly visible on his cheeks and neck, and he couldn't give a clear explanation of where they came from. When he was asked to remove his shirt, similar scratches were found on his chest and shoulders. Detectives suspected the victim had left those marks while fighting for her life, but they needed to wait for experts to confirm. Martinez was arrested, initially for 6 months, while the investigation continued. The second suspect. Forensics confirmed that blood and skin particles from Martinez were found under the victim's nails, but the bite marks on her body didn't match his dental impressions. The police continued to question hotel guests and staff until a 36-year-old man named Luis Carlos Miranda came into focus. He wasn't a regular guest and didn't work at La Mansion Inn, but he was a friend of the hotel owner, which allowed him to stay there for free. One of the bite marks on the victim's body could have been made by Luis, but it wasn't clear enough to be certain. Still, the police arrested him as a second suspect for 6 months, just like Martinez. Miranda, too, denied ever seeing Maria Luisa or having any contact with her. The third suspect. About a week and a half after the shocking murder, a third suspect was arrested, Harry Bowden himself, the 69-year-old hotel owner. It's worth noting that Bowden, a businessman of Dutch origin, had extensive connections with politicians and entrepreneurs and owned several properties in different countries. What led to his arrest was that one of the bite marks on the victim's body matched Bowden's dental impressions. It also came to light that around 6 months before the murder, Bowden had undergone surgery at the hospital where Cedeno worked. Despite Bowden insisting that he had never seen the woman before, police believed he might have noticed her during that time, taken her contact information, and lured her to his hotel. Initially, due to his age and health issues, Bowden was placed under house arrest. However, when he suddenly changed his residence without notifying the police, he was taken into custody, as there were fears he might try to leave the country. There was a fourth person involved in the case, Bowden's young husband, a man named Yader Daniel Abanda. However, no evidence was found against him. Abanda denied involvement in the crime, claiming that his partner was not feeling well that night and did not leave their room. The investigation's theory. Once the autopsy and forensic results were in, investigators concluded that there were 3 attackers. There were no signs of ropes or restraints used to immobilize the victim, but all of her limbs showed bruises from fingers and palms, indicating she was held down by hand. In Maria Luisa's mouth, experts found fabric fibers and a thread, which suggested she had been gagged. This likely explained why none of the other guests or staff heard any screams, even though the victim's injuries and signs of torture showed she must have desperately called for help. In Maria's phone, found in her room, there were messages to her sister, where she praised the hotel, saying how beautiful, cozy, and quiet it was. She mentioned how attentive and helpful the staff was, and she even noted that she had spent the evening chatting and dancing at the bar with a man who served coffee and looked after the property. Based on the description, this was Martinez. From the beginning, Martinez was the prime suspect. He was the only one of the 3 suspects with visible scratches. His skin and blood were found under the victim's fingernails, and his biological material was found in her body despite attempts to wash it off. However, casts of his teeth did not match the bite marks on her skin. Since Maria Luisa hadn't left her room after returning that evening and hadn't let anyone in, investigators believed that the attackers entered her room through the door leading to the courtyard. She might have left it unlocked so her dog could go out, and since the neighboring rooms were empty, no one would have noticed. The attackers likely moved quickly. Once inside, they knocked Maria unconscious with a blow to the head, gagged her, and then tortured and assaulted her for several hours. When they were done, they strangled her so violently with their bare hands that they broke her neck. Afterward, they washed her body in the bathroom, placed it on the bed, and wrapped it in a sheet, contaminating the bite marks with her own saliva. The trial. All 3 suspects denied any involvement in the crime, each claiming they were asleep in their rooms that night. But there were no witnesses to confirm their alibis except for the hotel owner's husband, whose testimony was questionable from the start. However, strange text messages were found on the suspects' phones. In them, they shared disturbing intimate fantasies, and the day before the crime, they talked about a guest who was alone. The public trial didn't begin until September 2022, more than 2 years after the murder. 71-year-old Harry Bowden appeared in court in a wheelchair as his knee problems had worsened, making it difficult for him to walk. Right away, the prosecution faced challenges in proving the involvement of Bowden and Miranda. The evidence against them was mostly circumstantial. Text messages on their phones and dental impressions, which the defense argued should be dismissed because the bite marks weren't a perfect match with their dental records. The expert who was supposed to testify about the bite marks on the victim had been hired by Bowden's lawyer. This orthodontist flew in from Madrid and claimed that the marks found on the victim's skin weren't strong enough evidence and couldn't definitively link the suspects to the crime. The day after his testimony, the expert returned to Spain, but the prosecution questioned his credibility. A follow-up investigation revealed that this individual wasn't properly accredited and was only a so-called expert by name. His testimony was thrown out, but the prosecution still struggled to prove the connection between the 2 main suspects and the bite marks. The prosecution argued that a crime this brutal and calculated couldn't have been committed by just one person. They believed at least 3 people were involved in the assault and murder. The defense, however, challenged this, pointing out that one strong man could have carried out the crime alone. The verdict. The only undeniable evidence was against Teodor Herrera Martinez. In addition to his semen being found inside the victim and his skin particles under her nails, investigators also found Maria Luisa's blood on both the outside and inside of his shoes, with the shoe prints matching those found at the threshold of her room and near the bed. As a result, Martinez was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 50 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. Given that he was 40 years old at the time of sentencing, this was effectively a life sentence. Martinez admitted that he had been intimate with the victim that night, but claimed it was consensual and insisted that someone else must have killed her after he left. Since there was no solid evidence against Bowden and Miranda, aside from the bite marks and text messages, their involvement couldn't be proven. Both men were acquitted and released in March 2023. However, in September of that same year, an appeals court reviewed a complaint filed by the victim's family and ordered the case to be reopened. By that time, though, both Bowden and Miranda had long since left Costa Rica. They fled the country as soon as they were released from court. Currently, they are living in the Netherlands, and even if the new trial finds them guilty, they won't face any punishment. This is because there is no extradition agreement between the Netherlands and Costa Rica, despite the severity of the crime. Thanksgiving is a traditional family holiday. During this time, multiple generations gather around a festive table in the home of the elders. Each person present is expected to express gratitude for the blessings of the past year and to show love and respect for their relatives. This is how it goes for most families. However, there are those who disregard these established customs. In such relationships, things often leave much to be desired, and even significant dates hold little meaning. For domestic violence, there are no restraining factors. The boundaries of what is acceptable have long been broken. This is a new story about the horrific events that took place in one American family on the eve of a national holiday. Call for help. On November 23, 2006, at 3:46 p.m., a call was made to the Memphis, Tennessee Emergency Services. It's understood that misfortunes don't take holidays or weekends, so it can't be said that the atmosphere at 911 was relaxed. However, the dispatcher who took the call was in shock, as he later admitted to a colleague. What startled the operator was the absolute calmness of the caller, as if he wasn't asking for help but placing a breakfast order. The man identified himself as Jeffrey Scott and reported that his wife had been unconscious since 11 a.m. At the same time, a voice in the background corrected him, saying that the woman was most likely dead. When the dispatcher asked for clarification, Scott stated, "She was breathing a second ago and now she's dead." His voice didn't waver. Information about a possible crime was immediately relayed to the rescue service leadership, and a specialized team was dispatched to the scene. The victim. Law enforcement arrived at the address within minutes. They were met by the homeowner, who led them to the bedroom where his wife, Ashley Scott, lay. Upon entering the room, they saw someone bending over her, performing CPR. The man introduced himself as Dr. Robert McGee, a friend of Jeffrey. He said the woman was still alive, but on the brink of death. Her pulse was barely detectable, and her blood pressure was dangerously low. Medics examined the woman and agreed with his assessment. They suspected that she had sustained a head injury from a blunt object and was close to death. Her pupils were dilated and unresponsive to light, and blood was coming from her mouth and nose. Additionally, Ashley's body showed signs of trauma. Her legs, chest, and back bore numerous bruises and abrasions. The medical team attempted emergency resuscitation. They intubated her, used a defibrillator, and administered heart-stimulating drugs, but none of it helped. The young woman was dying before their eyes. In the end, she was rushed to the hospital. A neurosurgeon was called to assess her condition in the emergency department. His diagnosis was grim and confirmed his colleagues' opinions. The 28-year-old woman was in a critical state, at the final stage of brain death. There was nothing that could be done to help her. Her body systems and vital organs were shutting down. As a result, it was decided not to prolong the patient's suffering and to disconnect her from life support. She passed away shortly after. There was no doubt that Ashley had been brutally deprived of life. Her right ear was green, a color typical of those who box and take repeated blows to the same spot. Additionally, a man's shoe print was visible on her back. It seemed as though someone had trampled, if not jumped, on her. Her fragile body was covered in bruises at various stages of healing, indicating that she had been subjected to periodic violence. Family doctor. While doctors fought for the life of a young and beautiful woman, police officers were questioning McGee and Scott. The doctor explained that he was the one who insisted on calling emergency services and shared what he knew. At 2:30 p.m., Jeffrey, his friend, called him. The men had met during their college years and occasionally kept in touch. Over the phone, Jeffrey mentioned that he had been drinking with his wife the night before, and afterward she felt unwell. She went to bed, but never woke up. He then decided to seek professional help. At the time, the doctor was busy but postponed his duties and arrived at the couple's home. There, he found Jeffrey next to his wife, who showed no signs of life. The doctor suspected that the couple had quarreled and something unfortunate had occurred, which they wanted to keep quiet about. That's why they contacted him. He knew that the couple had been going through tough times recently. Each reacted differently. Ashley drank, and Jeffrey was quick to anger and often raised his hand against her. When the doctor examined Ashley, he realized that the situation was far more severe than he had initially thought. There was no chance of survival, and the poor woman needed immediate medical attention. He insisted that Jeffrey call 911. At the same time, Robert pieced together the situation in his mind. He understood that something much more serious had happened, possibly a premeditated crime. He admitted to the police that he had deliberately delayed Scott at the scene to prevent him from fleeing. Jeffrey's lies. Throughout this, Jeffrey remained utterly emotionless. It seemed as though he had no concern for the future of the woman he once loved. When asked by the police what had happened, he explained that the previous evening they had argued. The reason was the discovery of Ashley's messages with another man. He believed his wife was cheating on him. Unable to bear the betrayal, he struck her, but only once. After that, she stumbled and fell, as she was heavily intoxicated. Jeffrey noted that his wife frequently abused alcohol and behaved irrationally. He didn't want to tolerate her outbursts anymore and kicked her out of the house. In such instances, she would usually sleep in the garage. In the morning, he found his wife there, still asleep. Feeling pity, Jeffrey carried her into the house and laid her on the bed. Time passed, but she didn't wake up. That's when he realized something was wrong and tried to revive her himself. Then he contacted his doctor friend and called him to the house. However, the police didn't believe his story. When they arrived, the woman was covered in bruises from head to toe. She was bleeding, with her face and head battered. Even if she had been drunk and fallen, she wouldn't have caused such injuries to herself. It was clear she had been beaten. Scott was arrested and charged with aggravated assault. As soon as the autopsy results came in, the charge was upgraded to first-degree crime. Autopsy results. The pathologist's report was chilling. The cause of Ashley Scott's death was a subdural hematoma on the right side of her brain. Such injuries are caused by a severe blow to the head. Her brain essentially slammed against her skull, leading to massive bleeding and swelling, cutting off the oxygen supply. This caused her body systems and organs to begin failing. It's an excruciating process. What's even more tragic is that she could have been saved if help had been provided in time, preferably within the first few hours. Additionally, more than 50 hematomas were found on her body. They varied in color and density, confirming the medic's statements that the woman had been repeatedly assaulted. It was hard to imagine the torment Ashley had endured over time. The most horrifying aspect was that the person who inflicted this suffering was the one who was supposed to protect her. Evidence. After Jeffrey's arrest, detectives began examining the crime scene. Signs of a struggle were found throughout the house. Items were scattered everywhere, and furniture was overturned. A broken vase lay in the living room. On the kitchen table, near a laptop, were printed messages between Ashley and her lover, confirming the suspect's claims about the motive for the crime. Upon closer inspection of the garage, officers found bloodstains on the floor. Inside Mrs. Scott's car were women's clothes, and other personal items. There was also a handbag containing her documents and passport. It appeared that the deceased had planned to escape, but she didn't make it. Officers then decided to speak with the family's relatives and friends, which revealed unexpected details about their lives and circumstances, shedding light on the incident. Unfortunately, it happens that women fall in love with the wrong men and tie their lives to them. Initially, everything seems bright and promising, but soon the object of their affection turns into a dreadful tyrant, and life with them becomes a nightmare. The victim of both emotional and physical abuse loses their sense of reality and may even justify the abuser's actions. In these cases, outside psychological help is needed, as the victim is often unable to help themselves or escape the situation. The kind soul of Ashley Pittman. Ashley Scott, née Pittman, was born on November 4, 1978, in Bossier City, Louisiana. Her parents separated while she was still in her mother's womb. However, fate smiled upon Donna, and she met Jimmy Pittman, whom she later married. Jimmy adopted Ashley and loved her from the moment she was born. Notably, Jimmy already had a 5-year-old daughter named Kika. Unfortunately, Jimmy and Donna's marriage didn't last long, and they divorced a few years later. It's important to note that Donna left the family herself and eventually remarried. Ashley chose to stay with her father but continued to see her mother. Despite her parents' divorce, Ashley had a good childhood. She grew up kind and obedient. Everyone around her considered her a true beauty and predicted a bright future for her. In 1996, she graduated from high school and then enrolled at Ouachita Baptist University in Arkansas. It was there that she met her first love. Jeffrey Scott had attended the same school as her and, by a stroke of fate, enrolled at the same university. Jeffrey also noticed the beautiful girl with a radiant smile, and before long, they started dating. The young couple seemed perfect, always together and holding hands. Ashley's friends envied her, believing she had found a reliable partner. Ashley fueled their curiosity by sharing how sweet and kind he was and how lucky she felt to have him. In 2000, Pittman received her long-awaited degree in education. Now, her childhood dream was about to come true. She wanted to become a teacher and dedicate her life to children. Unhappy celebrations. Finally, on June 9, 2001, Ashley and Jeffrey got married. However, things didn't go as they had appeared in her girlhood dreams. Unexpectedly for everyone, a dark side of her chosen one came to light. To be more precise, it became noticeable to others, although the bride herself had known about it but chose to ignore it. A year before the wedding, Ashley sent a letter to her sister, Kika, stating that she could no longer communicate with them, but they should respect her decision. Naturally, her family wasn't invited to the wedding either. Friends of Ashley, who had the fortune to attend the ceremony, were shocked. The overwhelming majority of guests were from the groom's side, while Ashley had a large, close-knit family. This struck them as odd. However, they later understood why. The reason was that her family did not share her views on Jeffrey, and he made no effort to change their minds. Behind the seemingly nice guy lurked something sinister. He frequently spoke ill of her family and behaved inappropriately. He offended those close to her and felt justified in doing so. What was most surprising was her reaction. It was as if Ashley was making excuses for him. During the wedding, Jeffrey once again insulted some of her friends and acted arrogantly. Eventually, when the newlyweds moved to Cordova, a suburb of Memphis, Tennessee, her relationships with many people deteriorated. Those who didn't turn away from her continued to stay in touch, but kept their distance. The dark side of Jeffrey Scott. After the move, the head of the family started working as a computer systems technician at his father's company, while the newly minted Mrs. Scott became an English teacher at a middle school. Everyone spoke highly of her. Ashley was considered beautiful and cheerful, intelligent and sociable. She loved her job and her students. Later, Paul Dooley described his colleague as a skilled specialist and talented educator. She was the main reason to get up in the morning and go to English class, he shared. In court, He admitted that the school was the only place where she felt safe and loved. The educational institution became a refuge where Jeffrey Scott couldn't reach her. Indeed, as time passed, the relationship between the spouses worsened. Ashley's connection with her family nearly broke. She didn't want to discuss it and called the situation her personal choice. Without a doubt, these conclusions were made under the influence of a master manipulator. Her husband was precisely that. In the early years, he completely dominated her and cut her off from outside support. Daily criticisms for every little thing lowered her self-esteem. Scott suppressed his wife in any way he could. During this period, she communicated with only a few people. Among them was her childhood friend, Lori. The girls had been friends since 5th grade and maintained contact into adulthood. Reunion evening. In September 2006, a high school reunion was planned for the school where Ashley studied. She was eager to attend, and despite her husband's reluctance, she went to the event. Those present didn't notice any significant changes in her. However, Lori was concerned. Throughout the evening, Jeffrey constantly called his wife, not allowing her to relax and enjoy herself. He asked whom she was talking to, what she was wearing, what she was eating and drinking, and what she was discussing. In short, he tried to control every minute of her life. That evening, Ashley confessed to Lori the nightmare she was living in and said she couldn't go on like this. She revealed that she was considering divorce and had even contacted a divorce attorney. She also admitted that she knew about her husband's repeated infidelities. She mentioned, for example, an affair with a colleague named Blair Brown, with whom she had once gotten along well. However, she noted that over time, she forgave her acquaintance. Blair had reached out to her to share who Jeffrey really was and how dangerous he could be. It should be noted that this party was the last in the young woman's life. After that, she didn't speak to anyone for several weeks, and new bruises appeared on her body. Lori's testimony. Detectives became interested in the stories shared by Ashley's relatives and friends. Through conversations with them, they gathered a lot of valuable information. Lori also revealed that shortly before Ashley's death, Jeffrey had called her several times to complain about his wife. He claimed that she drank heavily, lost her balance, and often fell, which explained why she was covered in bruises. However, the next morning, Ashley wouldn't remember these events and would blame him. He attributed her growing alcohol dependency to their mutual acquaintance, Blair, claiming that she had corrupted Ashley and turned her against him. He also mentioned that he no longer wanted to have children because he felt disgusted with his wife after everything that had happened. Scott accused his wife of constant infidelity, lying, and alcoholism. However, Lori didn't believe any of this and thought he was trying to justify himself. Eventually, Lori realized that Ashley had become a victim of domestic violence and was in serious trouble. After each of these calls, she would try to call her friend back, but Ashley wouldn't pick up, which was very strange. The last time they saw each other was shortly before the tragic events. The friends went shopping, but Ashley didn't buy anything for herself. She was sad and pensive. Lori tried to talk to her about her marriage, but Ashley said she didn't want to ruin the evening and changed the subject. The only thing she mentioned about the impending divorce was that she was ready to take that step but was very afraid. She knew Jeffrey well and feared his reaction could be completely unpredictable. Blair's testimony. Next, Blair Brown, whose name frequently came up in the Scott family, was called in for questioning. She admitted that she had indeed been Jeffrey's lover in the past. Therefore, she knew firsthand about his uncontrollable fits of rage. It was established that the friendship between the two women was rekindled about 6 months before the crime. Blair felt sympathy for her and provided occasional support. She also admitted that her relationship with Jeffrey was a mistake and apologized repeatedly for it. The women sometimes met and had drinks together. Ashley would often hide at Blair's place to get away from Jeffrey. One day, he tracked her down and came for her. At that moment, Blair witnessed a brutal attack. Scott struck his wife several times in the face and threw her out onto the street, completely unfazed by the presence of a witness. Even after these events, Ashley downplayed his guilt and made excuses for him. The accused. During another interrogation, Scott admitted that he contacted Robert McGee only 12 to 15 hours after the argument. All that time, his wife had been unconscious, alone in the garage. Jeffrey continued to insist that he had only struck her once because of the discovered infidelity. After that, he sent her to the garage, brought bedding, and threw it on the floor. The bleeding woman was left to spend her last hours freezing and suffering in pain, while her husband rested comfortably in the house. However, the autopsy results did not support his claims. It was clear that he had always treated his wife poorly. Additionally, detectives learned that Jeffrey occasionally used the services of escorts, even when Ashley was at the reunion. Despite this, he blamed her for all their problems. Indeed, shortly before she decided to file for divorce, Ashley met a young man named Michael Lowe. They exchanged messages from October 29th to November 22nd, 2006. He was the one who encouraged her to leave her husband, assuring her that he would support her and had everything ready for her departure. Michael told her that he loved her and wanted to show her a different life. When Jeffrey read their messages, he was enraged and decided to teach his unfaithful wife a lesson. The trial and the advocate. The trial of Jeffrey Scott began on January 13, 2009. The prosecution argued that it was a premeditated crime. It was evident that the argument between the spouses started in the living room, where a vase was found broken. They then moved through the house, with Ashley enduring violence in nearly every room. Bloodstains were found in almost every room. The divorce attorney Ashley had consulted testified for the prosecution. She explained that she had met with Ashley the day before her death. At that point, all the documents for the divorce were ready. All her client had to do was pack her things and leave the house while her husband was at work. Rachel advised that Ashley should leave secretly. This explains the items and documents found in her car. However, Ashley didn't follow the expert's advice. She didn't want to leave without explaining to her husband, which turned out to be a fatal mistake. The advocate tried her best to help Ashley and even provided her services for a symbolic fee. The attorney also mentioned that she knew her client had been drinking and had quit her beloved job because of it. She did this to numb the emotions she felt in her marriage and needed support. For a long time, the women communicated in secret. This was done to ensure Ashley's departure was as safe as possible. Since her husband controlled all calls, they met on neutral ground or communicated via payphone. Many witnesses confirmed that they had seen scratches or bruises on Ashley, which she carefully concealed under layers of makeup. Some knew the real cause of the injuries but felt powerless to help. In their final report, the medical examiners noted that Ashley had frequently been kicked. It seems Jeffrey would knock her to the ground and then stomp on her. Old bruises from shoes were found on her back and legs. The devil's advocate. The defense team for the accused worked tirelessly to reduce the charge to second-degree crime. The attorney painted the victim in an unflattering light, portraying her as an alcoholic and unstable hysteric. In short, they did everything possible to make the jury believe that Scott also suffered in the marriage. The defense discredited the victim, who couldn't defend herself because she was no longer alive. It was revealed that in 2005, Ashley had been fined for drunk driving. Meanwhile, Jeffrey claimed he wanted to repair the marriage, bought a new home, and was open to having children, all for a woman who had a lover and exchanged intimate photos with him. Regarding the crime itself, he claimed he lost control, realizing his efforts were futile and that Ashley had found someone else. "I regret the pain I caused you," he addressed his wife's family, "but I mourn her loss and pray for her soul." In contrast, during the trial, it was noted that after his arrest, Scott didn't ask about his wife's condition. Instead, he inquired about the outcome of a recent football game. His attorney played dirty. During his statement, he even claimed that the victim sustained most of her injuries during a seizure caused by alcohol withdrawal. An independent expert was found to back up this claim. To refute this, the assistant county medical examiner was called to testify. He read the autopsy results, listed all the injuries on the body, and most importantly, stated the cause of death, which could not have resulted from accidental falls. Prosecutor's argument. The prosecutor argued that the defense's version of an unintentional crime was absurd. It was clear that the victim wanted to escape her tormentor, but, out of affection for her husband, hoped to end things amicably. Meanwhile, the accused showed her the printout of her messages with Michael and attacked her. As he struck her repeatedly, he knew he was causing unbearable pain and suffering. He then finished her off in the garage, where she lost consciousness. Scott saw the severity of her injuries but ignored them and didn't seek medical help. The criminal chose to wait and only then called a doctor. The prosecutor insisted that the accused wanted his wife dead. However, a surprising fact came to light. Investigators found evidence that Ashley had wanted to save the marriage. It was discovered that she had been taking special medication to get pregnant and had supported the purchase of a new home. Perhaps she was so dependent on the toxic relationship that she couldn't imagine life without Jeffrey. However, she eventually decided to leave. It's possible she didn't want to leave secretly, hoping to hear from her husband that he would change and everything would be fine. Victims of abuse often cling to such illusory hopes. Guilty verdict. On January 19, 2009, Jeffrey Scott was found guilty of second-degree crime. Even the judge was dissatisfied with the jury's verdict, criticizing the jurors because the vote in favor of the original charge was 12-1. There was one person who didn't believe the accused was guilty enough. According to state law, a unanimous decision is required to convict someone of first-degree crime. The victim's family was also disheartened. The accused will spend 25 years behind bars without the possibility of parole. Conclusion. Perhaps this punishment isn't enough for someone who tormented a woman for years. The tyrant isolated her from everyone, brainwashed her, and made her think that she and her family weren't good enough to be part of his life. Nevertheless, Ashley's father said, "This is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. I loved that little girl. If she had died a natural death, I would have come to terms with it over time. But knowing how cruelly my daughter died and who was responsible, I will never be able to accept it." The story of Ashley Scott's life teaches us many things, but most importantly, no matter what happens, we should never isolate ourselves from our loved ones. Sometimes, they are the only ones who truly care about us and can help us. The case of Paula Ortega. In early 2023, the city of Sangolquí in Ecuador's Pichincha region was rocked by a tragic incident. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that shocked the community, but its motive, a mere $600 theft. Could the life of 37-year-old Paula Ortega Alcocer really be valued at just $600? Born in March 1986, Paula was the second child in a large family. She excelled at Dario Figueroa Lara School and later attended the Polytechnic University, where she developed a keen interest in the hospitality industry. After her studies, Paula actively contributed to the growth of her family's business, which specialized in party goods manufacturing. The Ortega Alcocer family was well-to-do and renowned in Sangolquí and neighboring Ecuadorian towns. Paula's father, in his youth, began building a business supplying party goods across Ecuador. The venture became quite successful, enabling him to start his own production of balloons, piñatas, and other festive paraphernalia. This expansion led to the opening of several stores. The Alcocer family's party shops were located not only in Sangolquí, but also in Ecuador's capital, Quito. Each family member played a role in the development and maintenance of their enterprise. The father expanded the main production line, opening new workshops for balloons, garlands, caps, and various party items. Each of the three children managed a store, tailoring it to their vision. Paula's entrepreneurial spirit led her beyond just managing a store. She organized a party planning service within the company, which turned out to be a great success. It seemed Paula had found her calling, bringing joy to people, which made her truly happy. While the business ventures of the Ortega family flourished for a long time, unfortunately, Paula Ortega's personal life was not as successful. Despite her youthful and joyous demeanor, she faced significant hardships in her private life. Paula's first marriage to Carlos Pedro turned out to be unhappy. After the birth of their daughter, Carlos developed an alcohol addiction. He began disappearing from home and stealing money from Paula's store. His infidelity was the last straw, leading Paula to end the marriage and find herself alone with her daughter. This period was particularly challenging for Paula, as she lost hope in finding personal happiness. However, the psychological support of her family and her passion for her work helped her regain a sense of normalcy in her life. A decade later, Paula met Christian Diego. A tall, dark-haired, and handsome man, Christian was 4 years younger than Paula. Having lost faith in finding a worthy partner, Paula was cautious with the persistent young suitor. Christian proved to be calm and reliable, quickly bonding with Paula's daughter, which greatly impressed Paula. After 2 years of relationship, her heart warmed to him, leading to a beautiful wedding ceremony. Christian embraced Paula's daughter as his own, and they soon welcomed another daughter, Maria. Christian and Paula spent 5 years together, with Christian fully integrating into Paula's father's company. He was entrusted with finding locations for new stores, which often kept him away from home. Coming from a modest working-class family, Christian had always dreamed of owning a large business. Unfortunately, some people can conceal their dark sides so well that one might live for years alongside ruthless criminals without suspecting a thing. However, the truth eventually comes to light when evil erupts in the most unexpected ways. Paula Ortega and her husband, Christian, appeared to be the epitome of a happy, successful couple to their family, friends, and neighbors. However, this perception was only surface deep. In 2000, Paula's father passed away after a long illness. His death not only devastated the family, but also turned their business upside down. Christian, driven by a desire for power and the wealth it brought, eagerly sought to take Paula's father's place in the business. However, his lack of skill led to one failed deal after another. As a result, Christian began to vent his frustration on his family. Initially in secret, but later openly, he began to abandon his family, indulging in a life of debauchery. Women and alcohol became his escape into a world of pleasure and recklessness. With Paula's father no longer there to restrain him, Christian's true nature began to surface. Having already experienced a traumatic marriage, Paula refused to endure this behavior again. The couple's home became a battleground of endless scandals, revealing Christian's true nature as an ambitious egotist, craving only power and unquestioned obedience. After a particularly nasty argument, Paula secretly filed for divorce, fearing her husband's reaction. The news of this drastically changed Christian's behavior. Unwilling to lose his place in the successful family, he stopped his outrageous conduct and appeared to transform for the better. He expressed remorse, claiming to be caught up in a whirlwind of confusion, and professed his love and value for his family. His eloquence persuaded Paula. Not wanting to be alone again, she gave him a second chance. In a gesture of reconciliation, Christian suggested organizing a romantic dinner at their home. Paula agreed. She sent their daughters to her parents' house and began preparing for the evening. Inside, she was aflutter with excitement. Deep down, she still dreamed of a happy, strong family and was doing everything she could to preserve it. The evening at the Ortega home was one of celebration and comfort. The living room was lit up with festive garlands, and the dining table was warmly illuminated by the yellow glow of candles. Christian uncorked a bottle of dry white wine while Paula served a hot meal. The night could have been genuinely reconciliatory, had it not been for a sudden proposal from Christian that disrupted the peace. Christian, a co-owner of the Alcozar company, revealed to his wife a significant misstep. In his pursuit to replace Paula's father and gain full control, he had made a costly mistake in an important tender, leading to substantial losses for the company. Now, the firm desperately needed a new investor, implying that a part of the company would officially change hands. Paula was adamantly against this, believing her father's business should remain a family affair. Despite Christian's persuasion, she stood her ground, infuriating him. He had already found an investor and was eager to complete the deal without complications. Their dinner, and by extension their relationship, soured. January 2nd, 2023, seemed like any other day. Paula took her younger daughter to the playroom before heading to her shop for work. She had a large order to prepare, involving assembling balloon fountains and party decorations for a themed event. During her lunch break, two men knocked on the shop's door. Although closed, Paula opened it, expecting a courier to pick up the balloon bouquets. The men, slim and dressed identically as if they were twins, startled her with their dark hoodies. They lingered, scanning the shop before splitting up. As Paula called out to them, stating the shop was closed for lunch, they cornered her against the wall. The tension of this silent scene was broken by a knock on the glass door. The men hastily exited the shop. A smiling young courier arrived, unwittingly rescuing Paula from the unknown assailants. Shaken, Paula handed over the package, closed the shop, and with trembling hands, called her mother. She was visibly frightened, a sentiment she expressed over the phone. Paula's mother suggested reporting the unsettling incident at her shop to the police, but Paula declined, attributing her reaction to mere fright since nothing harmful had actually occurred. She didn't reopen her shop that day, her thoughts consumed by Christian's actions and the identity and motives of the two mysterious men. Seeking solace, Paula decided to take a stroll through the city. She stopped at a nearby cafe for some coffee, walked through the park to breathe in the fresh air, and then visited her sister. Over cups of fragrant tea, they engaged in a heart-to-heart conversation. Overwhelmed by the day's shocking events, Paula confided in her sister not only about the scary encounter at her shop, but also about the difficulties in her marriage. She shared how Christian had drastically changed after her father's passing, indulging in alcohol and openly being unfaithful. Paula chose not to mention his proposal about merging the company with a new investor, as she habitually kept her personal struggles to herself. But that day, her emotions overpowered her pride and shame over tolerating such demeaning treatment. He's a peculiar being. My sister was lively, happy, cheerful, enterprising, hardworking, an extremely gentle and kind mother. She should have been receiving energy from him, Adriana Ortega, Paula's sister, would later say. Paula spoke of her long-term life plans, her desire for her daughters to grow up and become professionals, and her intention to continue her business. She was selfless and tirelessly hardworking, Adriana recalled. After her emotional talk with her sister, Paula headed home. A phone call from Christian interrupted her. He was picking up their daughter from the playroom and would come to the shop to pick her up as well. His hurried speech was interspersed with children's voices. Paula didn't get a chance to tell him about the frightening incident at her shop, especially since she suspected him to be involved. Reluctantly, Paula returned to work, once again prioritizing her family's well-being over her own. She didn't have to wait long. Christian arrived alone, explaining that their daughter had wanted to go home, and he couldn't deny his little princess. He informed Paula that the girls were at home and eagerly waiting for hamburgers for dinner. In what has become a modern family tradition, Christian took Paula not to the nearest fast food joint, but to a restaurant courtyard at a shopping center, several blocks from their home. Parking the car beside a secluded wall and locking it securely, he left Paula inside to collect their order. Relaxing in the passenger seat after a taxing day, Paula closed her eyes, unaware of the impending danger. Shortly, she recognized two familiar figures near the car, talking loudly and circling the vehicle. Recognizing them as the unexpected visitors from her shop, Paula tried to stay calm, trusting that the car was secure and Christian would return soon. Suddenly, the car's lights flashed and the door locks disengaged. In a panic, Paula scrambled to the back seat, hiding between the seats and covering her head with her arms, but she was trapped with no escape. One intruder casually got into the driver's seat while the other joined him in the back, pinning Paula down even more. She felt something warm trickling down her arm before darkness enveloped her. Paula sustained 11 knife wounds to her neck and 2 to her face. After the brutal attack, the assailants fled the scene, leaving Paula alone and gravely injured. Christian returned just 7 minutes later to a horrific sight. The car's interior was drenched in blood. Frantically, he called emergency services, but struggled to clearly communicate the situation and give emergency coordinates. He then called Paula's mother to report the attack before driving to the hospital himself. Tragically, Paula succumbed to her injuries in the emergency room. passing away before receiving necessary medical attention. Christian, overwhelmed by grief and shock at the loss of his wife, reacted with loud cries and throwing chairs in the waiting room. The sudden violent end of Paula Ortega left a community in shock and a family in profound grief, raising questions about the motive and identity of the attackers. The initial theory of the prosecution was a violent end inflicted during a robbery. It was later discovered that $600 and a gold necklace were missing from Paula's purse. This began an investigation. The prosecution's theory was confirmed when footage from city cameras showed two unknown men who had visited Paula's store earlier that day in the vicinity. Both were in hoodies, making it impossible to create a clear image of their faces, and their vague descriptions provided no clarity. 2 months after the tragic event, Paula's family demanded justice, but the investigation was at a standstill. A turning point came when Adriana Ortega, Paula's sister, gave testimony casting doubt on Christian's innocence. She informed the investigators about a conversation she had with Paula on the day of the incident. Adriana also mentioned that Christian regularly committed infidelity and domestic violence against Paula, who was contemplating divorce. This provided a perfect motive, as Christian, driven by ambition, could not afford to lose his wealth and status in the event of a divorce. The prosecution investigated this angle. During a search of their home, incriminating messages were found on Christian's phone, indicating multiple affairs and turbulent marital relations. A critical piece of evidence was documentation prepared for the transfer of the company to a private individual, which Paula had refused to sign. Following these revelations, the incident was investigated as a suspected homicide, as the prosecution continued to gather information implicating Christian Diego. New evidence emerged, unraveling the complex web of the couple's relationship. 2 weeks after the incident, we found out he transferred $2,000 to an unknown woman's account, said Adriana, Paula's sister, adding another layer of suspicion to the already convoluted case. The most shocking aspect, as claimed by relatives, was that Christian made a payment using Paula's account while she was dying from her injuries. Instead of immediately helping his gravely wounded wife, Christian seemingly bided his time. Investigations confirmed this information. The identity of the woman who received the transfer from Christian that day was established as 28-year-old Laura Castillo. Urgently summoned for questioning, she revealed that she had noticed her bank card missing a couple of days earlier, but didn't think much of it, as her brother often used her card. The electronic payment records showed a transfer of $2,000 from Christian on January 2nd at 20:05. However, Laura denied any acquaintance with Christian. Her solid alibi at the time of the incident absolved her of any involvement. She was released, and the investigation hit a dead end again. Days later, Laura returned to the police, stating her brother had returned the bank card, as she had suspected. She provided a full description of her brother's appearance, which matched one of the criminals caught on surveillance cameras near the car. In the chaos of fleeing the crime scene, one attacker forgot to pull up his hood. The identities of Byron and Mortines Castillo, two repeat offenders with a substantial criminal history, were established. The brothers were apprehended. But what could possibly link two seasoned criminals to a seemingly respectable and successful family man? Further investigation revealed that the attacks on Paula had been carried out repeatedly by the Castillo brothers. But why were these repeat offenders targeting this young woman? On December 8, 2022, Paula Ortega faced a harrowing incident at a gas station when her car was stolen. Distracted by a young man, his accomplice quickly jumped behind the wheel and sped off. Fortunately, her daughters weren't in the car that day. Surveillance footage identified the two familiar culprits. Coincidentally, on the day of the theft, Paula unknowingly came face to face with her future assailant. However, the car theft case took an unexpected turn when Christian intervened, claiming the thieves had contacted him. He met with them and retrieved all of Paula's personal belongings, including her wallet. This development cast further doubt on Christian's innocence. Seasoned investigators were puzzled by the widower's boldness in shielding the criminals. Surveillance cameras played a crucial role in identifying the carjackers. As Christian realized he was under suspicion, he concocted a new defense narrative involving extortion by two criminal brothers demanding a large sum of money. But before he could deploy his version of events, the police executed a swift interrogation strategy. Separating the suspects and suggesting one had confessed, they obtained a confession from Martin Castillo. He admitted that more than 2 months earlier, Christian had paid them $2,000 to murder his wife, promising another $2,000 after the deed. During a reenactment, Martin demonstrated how he inflicted 11 fatal knife wounds on the terrified woman. Realizing the crime was uncovered, he remorselessly divulged all details of their arrangement with Christian. Martin revealed that the car theft and the attack on Paula's shop were also parts of Christian's plan to pressure her. By chance, Paula lived a few hours longer than intended. On November 29, 2023, all 3 suspects appeared in court. The prosecution presented a comprehensive picture of the murder day, pieced together from various sources. Videos from surveillance cameras in the area where Christian parked the car, subjected to audio and video forensic analysis, unveiled a chilling, soul-freezing narrative. In chilling surveillance footage, Christian Diego is seen exiting his car and heading towards a shopping center elevator. Moments later, he remotely unlocks his car from half a block away, allowing 2 assailants to enter the vehicle and attack Paula. The prosecutor's report noted Christian's odd behavior post-attack, repeatedly looking back, approaching the car, pausing, returning, pacing back and forth, and making phone calls. Surprisingly, upon finding his wife bleeding profusely, he showed no shock or urgency to help her, instead driving her to a distant hospital. Christian's actions, meticulously reconstructed from surveillance videos, particularly in the first 4 minutes after Paula's attack, were cold and calculating. As she bled in the car but was still alive, Christian, standing nearby, callously transferred money to his accomplices for the assault. Paula's family lawyers urged the court to consider these videos as aggravating factors in the crime. The reconstructed sequence of events presented in court proves the crime was premeditated. Hours before the attack, around 1:30 p.m., 2 individuals entered Paula's store, dropped off nearby by Christian. This implies the crime was intended to occur earlier, during the lunchtime closure, when Paula was alone. Prosecutor Marlon Calderon highlighted inconsistencies. How did the assailants know the couple would be at the eatery if they weren't tailing them? Yet they arrived on time to commit the crime. Christian's actions, not fully raising the car window, unlocking the doors near the eatery, his 1,000 times pacing before aiding his wife, phone calls, and not seeking immediate medical attention at a nearby clinic are key evidence for charging him with orchestrating the femicide. Femicide, defined as the intentional murder of a woman simply because she is a woman, was a central theme in the trial of Christian and Paula Ortega's troubled relationship. Shockingly present in today's society, this hate crime was exemplified through Christian's younger age, which seemed to fuel his contempt and abuse towards Paula. Despite her success, Paula lived in a metaphorical golden cage, masking and enabling her husband's tyrannical behavior, allowing him to assert dominance. Years of silence culminated in Christian's sinister plot to seize control of Paula's thriving party empire and gain sole guardianship of their daughter, Maria. Testimonies from over 10 witnesses, including neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, alongside thorough examination of internal and external family communications, revealed Christian's true motives and objectives. Without legal signing rights, he sought to coerce Paula into transferring her company shares. However, his plan failed. Christian didn't physically harm Paula but inflicted severe psychological abuse, artfully concealed under the guise of a perfect family life. According to the Prosecutor General's report, video evidence led to Christian's preventive isolation as the crime's orchestrator. This measure isn't an arrest but a strategy to neutralize a societal threat. Following this action, Christian planned to flee. In the high-profile case against Christian Diego, accused of orchestrating his wife's demise, his defense team worked tirelessly to portray him as a victim. However, they were unable to refute crucial evidence like surveillance footage and falsified company transfer documents. Desperate, the defense then attempted to depict the accused as suffering from a mental disorder, citing episodes of sudden rage. Multiple psychiatrists evaluated Christian, but he was declared competent. His defense counsel, realizing the gravity of the situation, advised Christian to flee the country, asking if his passport was ready and suggesting he buy a ticket to Panama for the next day. However, this plan to escape justice failed. Christian's search for Central American flight tickets raised alarm bells with the authorities. The prosecutor swiftly ordered an 8-hour detainment of Christian Diego, followed by charges and the disclosure of case details to a judge specializing in domestic violence cases. Pending trial, the suspect was held in preliminary detention, pursued as the alleged mastermind behind the heinous act that left 2 young children motherless and an entire family grieving an irreplaceable loss. The Ortega family demands justice for this atrocious crime, emphasizing the devastating impact on the children and their irreplaceable loss. In a case that gripped public attention, the jury concluded that Christian and his 2 accomplices were guilty of a meticulously planned, intentional act of extreme brutality. The unremorseful Christian and his associates were sentenced to 26 years in prison. The municipal authorities of Rumiñahui expressed their solidarity with the tragic loss of Paula Alcocer. The institution extends its deepest sympathies to the family and friends affected by this incident. The unfortunate demise of this esteemed businesswoman, friend, mother, and wife, who contributed significantly to the canton's development and brought prosperity to those in her circle, is deeply mourned, their statement read. Paula's case emerged as a prominent instance of violence against women, following the Latin American Association for Alternative Development's report of 332 fatalities due to gender-based violence in 2022. Sherry Miller, who used sex, lies, and internet chat to organize a horrific crime, was arrested in February 2000. This crime is often referred to as the first internet-related murder in the United States. On December 22, 2000, Sherry Miller, a typical American mother of 3, was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree premeditated murder. She insisted on her innocence for nearly 17 years before pleading guilty in 2016. "I have ruined many lives. It's time to put an end to the lies and tell the truth," Sherry Miller pronounces before confessing. Bruce and Sherry were born and lived in Flint, Michigan, a poor town that was once an important cog in the Midwest auto industry. Sherry Paulette Keithley Miller was born October 13, 1971, and according to her, she had a very difficult childhood. The girl grew up without a father. Her mother led a dissolute lifestyle, drank a lot, and often changed men. Sherry's childhood was spent in a trailer, next to her mother's men, who often offended her. According to Sherry's words, she was abused from the age of 3 or 4. At 16, the girl was left alone. At 17, she married, became pregnant, and gave birth. The marriage broke up. Sometime later, Sherry remarried and divorced again. Her second husband, Tribby, was found guilty of second-degree child abuse for hitting his child hard. This resulted in multiple skull fractures. Sherry clearly picked the wrong men. Tribby was also tried for abusing his 6-year-old stepdaughter, but was found not guilty due to lack of evidence. Sherry was flitting from one man to another. She was on the lookout for someone who could take care of her. By the age of 26, Sherry found herself a single mother of 3 children by different men, working in a nursing home and selling Mary Kay cosmetics to make ends meet. She wasn't a beauty with model looks, but she was definitely attractive and charismatic. In 1997, the 26-year-old young woman takes a job as an accountant at B&D Auto Salvage, Bruce Miller's company. At this point, Sherry realizes that the 47-year-old successful business owner is the right man to provide her with stability and comfort. Bruce Leroy Miller was born on July 26, 1951. As a young man, he worked for General Motors for several years, as did many Flint residents. After leaving GM, Bruce continued in the auto scrapping business. In fact, he owned and operated an auto junkyard which involved taking in old cars, the parts from which were later resold. Bruce was married 3 times, loved racing, socializing with people, always showed generosity and openness. At first, he was not interested in Sherry Keithley, his new employee. Bruce only helped a single mother in a difficult life situation. But Sherry managed to hook Bruce. An office romance ensued. Despite the 20-year age difference, the couple's relationship developed rapidly. Bruce was flattered by the attention of a young woman, and the lovers quickly moved from dating to a life together. 4 months later, on April 23, 1999, a wedding took place in one of the chapels of Las Vegas. Sherry and her children moved in with Bruce, and she found the stability she had long dreamed of. Bruce's brother, Chuck Miller, would later tell the television program Snapped. She always said Bruce was the best thing that ever happened to her. She finally had a normal life and a man who could afford to make her happy. Chuck's wife, Judy, said Bruce was overwhelmed by the pretty young blonde whom he thought was the perfect wife. Only friends expressed misgivings about Sherry's need to spend money shopping beyond her means. She instantly maxed out her credit cards and spent all the cash she could find. "I was trying to fill a constant void," Sherry would later say. Despite her friends' misgivings, her hard-working husband didn't mind and turned a blind eye to his wife's spending habits. In any case, Sherry worked too. She was a Mary Kay cosmetics saleswoman, which allowed her to sell products to customers at home or while traveling across the country. To keep track of her accounts, her husband even bought a computer for her. It was this purchase that became the turning point. Sherry Miller accidentally discovered adult chat rooms on the internet when she was choosing a vacation destination using her home computer. In 1999, social networking didn't exist, and text messaging wasn't a common practice. Instead, people communicated with each other in online chat rooms. Some were adult in nature and were places where you could go and flirt anonymously, share your fantasies, and have a virtual romance. Bruce, according to friends, was aware of his wife's online flirting, but considered such behavior harmless. He loved his wife, was happily married, planned to adopt her children, and preferred to trust, not overshadowing his family life with suspicions. Sherry quickly settled into the virtual world and soon became accustomed to logging into chat rooms and sharing her deepest sexual fantasies with complete strangers under various promising aliases. Detective Kevin Shamlian, who investigated the murder case, told the court that Sherry had at least 25 different aliases. It wasn't until 2016 that Sherry admits, "I didn't get up from behind this computer. Bruce worked at the store and he had his own business, so he was away a lot. I spent hours flirting online. I wanted to control everything, obsessively control people who trusted me. It was like a video game, and every man and every relationship was a new level for me, and every level was harder." Among the men Sherry Miller met online was Jerry Cassidy, known by the pseudonym Reno Dudes. Jerry was born on October 6, 1960 in Kansas City, Missouri. He married, raised his son, loved deer hunting with his brothers, and dreamed of becoming an FBI agent. While working as a homicide detective, Jerry reported a corruption involving falsified records to one of his coworkers. In retaliation, he was demoted, eventually forced to resign after 9 years of service. Although Jerry did the right thing, the move ended his career. Jerry became depressed, began drinking and abusing substances. The marriage fell apart. After a while, he pulled himself together, moved to Reno, Nevada, and became a security guard at Harrah's Casino. Free time he spent in chat rooms, where he met Sherry Miller. Hot correspondence began, and in July 1999 they met in person in Reno, where Sherry came ostensibly to the convention of the company Mary Kay, taking with her friend. The online romance turned into a physical affair, and Jerry Cassidy thought life was beginning to change for the better. Sherry said she was a wealthy businesswoman living with a disabled husband, and therefore looking for a sexual encounter on the side. Jerry believed it. His friend and colleague, Carol Slaughter, would later recount. Sherry came into Jerry's life when he was at rock bottom. His marriage had broken up. He was in a new neighborhood where he had no friends. Jerry fell hard for Sherry, telling his friend Carol Slaughter that Sherry does absolutely everything in the bedroom. Throughout the summer and fall, Sherry used her cosmetics business as a cover for trips to Reno. When Sherry and Jerry were not together in Reno, they exchanged instant messages and emails of a sexual nature, including videos. Soon they even renamed their accounts, with Sherry calling herself Jerry's Fool and Jerry calling himself Sherry's Fool. It would seem that the ex-cop should have sensed something amiss, but the emails full of declarations of love apparently blinded him. Whether Jerry was simply gullible, flawed, or broken, he was an easy win for Sherry Miller. She wove a web of deception rather quickly and convinced him that he needed to kill her husband. The effect on Jerry was quite obvious to those who knew him. His acquaintances said that after this woman appeared, their friend became like a person with bipolar disorder, overly excited and active before she arrived and painfully depressed after she left. As early as September, Sherry announced that she was pregnant with Cassidy's child. She sent him pictures, a positive pregnancy test, and her belly. A short time later, Sherry revealed that her husband, Bruce Miller, found out about the pregnancy and beat her, causing her to lose the baby. In fact, in 1995, Sherry had undergone a fallopian tube ligation and could no longer have children. Jerry had no way of knowing this and believed his lover's lies. Very soon after losing the baby, Sherry announced that she was pregnant again. This time, however, she was pregnant with twins. Jerry begged his beloved to leave Bruce, take the children, and come to live with him. Sherry explained that she couldn't do it because Bruce had connections in the mafia, and he wouldn't let them leave for nothing. Supposedly, she was afraid for her life and Jerry's life. The young woman continued to drive to Reno. At one point, Jerry was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct at the casino. There was a pause in online correspondence for the duration of the arrest. When Jerry got out, he decided not to put Sherry in any more danger of being exposed to her husband Bruce and returned to Missouri to try to reconnect with his family. The couple continued their relationship online. Sherry sent photos of ultrasounds and her growing belly. "I just bulged out my belly. Jerry wanted to believe it so badly that I had no doubt. He would see the pregnancy even if it wasn't there," Miller would later say. Soon, on November 5, 1999, Jerry Cassidy received an email, presumably from Bruce Miller, in which he wrote that he knew about everything and would not let the bastards be born. A concerned Jerry tried to contact Sherry. Hours later, she texted him herself, informing him that she had to leave for a few days and that she would text him later. The next day, Jerry received a message from Bruce and learned that he had forced his wife to have an abortion. Attached to the letter were photos of a battered Sherry. "I remember standing in front of the mirror trying to draw bruises on my stomach," Sherry would later recount. Jerry had reached a tipping point. His children, not one but two twins at once, had been killed by Bruce Miller. He was again devastated and full of anger. He blamed Bruce for the deaths of his 3 children and the abuse of the woman he loved. After reconnecting with Sherry the next day, November 8th, Jerry said he couldn't go on like this. He would kill her husband. The couple set about devising a plan to kill him. They worked out routes, parking spots, and even the best place and time to get to the dump. Jerry then made the long drive from his home to Michigan. That same evening, as Bruce planned to leave work, he received a call from Sherry and, following the plan, asked if he could pick up a pizza on his way home. Distracted by the conversation, Bruce did not notice a man approaching him from behind, pointing his 20-gauge shotgun at him and pulling the trigger. After committing the crime, Jerry went home and Sherry began the next part of the plan. She called Bruce's brother, Chuck, said she was very worried about her husband's long absence, and asked Chuck to drive to the junkyard and see if everything was okay. When Chuck got there, he found his brother dead on the floor in a pool of blood. He had been shot in the chest with a shotgun at close range. According to eyewitnesses, when Sherry learned of Bruce's death, she began screaming and crying. The crime scene was quickly discovered, but no trace or evidence of the suspect remained. Detectives learned that Bruce carried large amounts of cash, and they initially thought his death may have been the result of a botched robbery as the dead man's wallet was missing. John Hutchinson, a friend and employee of Bruce's who had recently borrowed $2,000 from him, came under suspicion. Police questioned Hutchinson, searched his home, and confiscated weapons. John adamantly denied involvement. The search was inconclusive, and despite the fact that Hutchinson failed a polygraph test, he was eventually released. A theory of murder due to falsification of vehicle identification numbers was considered. However, none of the options did not give any leads, and soon the case was closed. Meanwhile, according to Bruce's sister, Judy Miller, Sherry's behavior did not fit most people's idea of a grieving spouse. 2 days after the death of her supposedly beloved husband, she was already dancing in a bar in Otisville, Michigan, and looked happy. 2 weeks later, she had a boyfriend, and it wasn't Jerry Cassidy, but a local delivery boy named Jeff Foster. The goal was accomplished. It was like Sherry had passed a level in a video game, and the former lover was no longer interesting. Jerry thought that after the murder, he would be with the woman he loved. After all, he killed for her. But that didn't happen. She began to distance herself, and a month after the murder, she moved her new boyfriend Jeff Foster into the house she used to share with her husband and completely severed her relationship with Jerry, leaving him devastated. It was probably at this point that Cassidy realized he had murdered an innocent man in cold blood, and guilt overwhelmed him. He turned from a lover to an investigator and realized that all the charges were fabricated by Sherry herself. 3 months later, on February 11th, 2000, Jerry shot himself in his Odessa, Missouri apartment with a .22 caliber rifle. His body was found in a chair with an open Bible in his lap. The Bible was open at Matthew 5 on murder. "Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be liable to judgment." He judged himself, pleaded guilty, and executed himself, Cassidy's mother will say in an interview. A few days after the body was removed, family members were cleaning the apartment and found a briefcase under the bed with 3 suicide notes and an envelope taped to the outside. Jerry wanted revenge on the woman who had broken his heart. The former detective confessed to killing Bruce Miller because Bruce, he believed at the time of the murder, had abused Sherry and caused the deaths of his 3 children. The letter explained that Sherry Miller had lied to him about Bruce's alleged behavior. "I went over there and killed him. I was such a fool, but now everyone will know the real story of why I got so depressed because I just couldn't tell anyone the truth. She wanted to get the money and get rid of her husband. Well, she got her way, but she would soon learn that she couldn't do that to people. I know now that it was all lies and Sherry's games. She didn't care about hurting anyone." To prove his point, Jerry attached printed transcripts of instant messages with Sherry, in which, in between intimate episodes, she gave him directions on how to find the dump, where to park to avoid being seen, and other important information. Attorneys for the Cassidy family contacted the Genesee County Sheriff's Department and relayed the information. On February 22, 2000, police waited for Sherry Miller as she was getting off a plane with her boyfriend, Jeff Foster. Ironically, they were returning from a trip to Reno. She was charged with second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Prosecutors believed Sherry was a skillful manipulator who convinced her lover to kill her husband under false pretenses. Despite a briefcase full of evidence, she insisted on her innocence to her deceased husband's family. On December 12, 2000, the state of Michigan's trial against Sherry Miller began, and her case made national headlines. Given the bizarre nature of an internet-related crime, public interest was abnormally high. The prosecution shared thousands of messages between Sherry and Jerry, demonstrating the woman's lies. She was never abused. She was never pregnant with Jerry's children, as she had undergone a fallopian tube ligation many years ago. According to the prosecution's version, Sherry wanted Bruce dead because of his money, as a divorce would not have given her enough money. However, the defense said that the young woman received only a minimal amount of money after her spouse's death. She would have lived a much more affluent life during her lifetime. The defense insisted that Jerry Cassidy was seeking revenge by being in the role of an abandoned lover, so he fabricated evidence. Sherry told the jury that the sexual communication between her and her lover was just part of an online fantasy. She said she lied about her pregnancy to help Jerry deal with depression and about the abuse to convince Jerry to leave her alone. Sherry adamantly denied writing the messages describing the crime, insinuating that Jerry had forged the messages using his experience as a homicide detective. However, police found evidence of the messages on Sherry's computer. Online correspondence played a crucial role in the trial. Miller was found guilty on December 22nd and sentenced to life in prison on the murder charge and 54 to 81 years on the conspiracy charge. In 2007, she was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and found to have other mental illnesses while in prison. Sherry began treatment and filed an appeal. She even managed to get married for the 4th time. Michael DeNoia saw the story on the news and couldn't resist the woman's charm. Michael wrote, Sherry wrote back, and in 2008, he visited the criminal in prison and proposed. Some reports say they actually married in April 2008, although there is no evidence of this union. Miller won an appeal in 2008 and was released from prison in 2009. A federal judge overturned Sherry Miller's conviction, saying Jerry's suicide letter should not be considered as evidence because Cassidy is dead, and the defense cannot cross-examine him. The judge ruled that a new trial was necessary and released Sherry, setting a bail amount. In 2012, Sherry was sent back to jail to continue serving her original sentence after the court reinterpreted the admissibility of the suicide letter. By this time, Sherry had spent 3 years on the outside. She continued to insist on her innocence. In 2016, Sherry Miller, in a 4-page typewritten letter sent to a district judge, suddenly admitted her role in her husband's death. Everyone got a shock. No one expected her to ever voluntarily do so. The letter sent to the judge was seen by many as just another manipulation to gain sympathy or profit. Something happened inside me when I had to go back to prison after 3 years of freedom. You see, I had my daughter and granddaughter living with me. I begged my daughter not to come with me as I was being taken back to this prison. She wouldn't listen. As I walked through the sliding doors and looked back at my daughter, she was crying so hard. I remember hearing her scream, "No, Mommy, no, don't go." After that moment, the full implications of what I had done to Bruce, his friends, his family, Jerry, his friends and his family hit me with full force. They will never see them again. Bruce was a great man, Sherry Miller wrote of her husband. He never hurt me or my children. All he did was love us. He wanted to adopt my children. He just wanted a family. The only man who loved me, and I ordered him killed. In 2022, Sherry gave a public interview to a popular TV station. She admitted that Bruce was not involved with the mob and never abused her. She admitted that she used makeup to fake bruises and faked ultrasound scans to manipulate Jerry. According to Sherry, she didn't do it for the money. She said that she was afraid Bruce would find out who she really was and felt that it would be easier for him to be killed than to learn the truth about her. Sherry admitted that she knew about Jerry's tendency toward depression and the briefcase of evidence, but was confident that she would talk herself out of anything and could manipulate the jury and the court. She was so convinced of this that she turned down a plea bargain that could have gotten her 15 years instead of a life sentence. According to Sherry, it took a public story to find peace with herself. It's still very hard for me to look in the mirror, realizing what I did. I've been waiting to tell the truth, and hopefully get a sense of peace from it. Sherry Miller remains incarcerated at the Huron Valley Women's Complex in Michigan. She is not eligible for parole. Every 7th crime on Earth happens within families, and over 38% of these are committed by men. Moreover, domestic violence is most prevalent in developed countries. Approximately 33–50% of all women who die violent deaths are killed by their husbands or partners, highlighting the critical need to protect women from domestic crimes. But why does a woman's desire for a strong man by her side sometimes lead her straight into the hands of a monster? Maybe it's because some are willing to have that strong shoulder at any cost. After all, society and family teach us that a woman needs a man by her side. We are raised that way. And then, some women end up enduring violence. This happened in 2012. Ekaterina Gureva was just 26 years old, and her killer is already out of prison and back in Izhevsk. Let's dive into a new story. Izhevsk is a large industrial city in the Russian Federation and is a scientific, educational, and cultural center of the Volga region. Located west of the Ural Mountains, this capital of Udmurtia is renowned for its weapons manufacturing and engineering industries. When visiting, one can admire the city's architecture, experience Udmurt culture, and explore the famous Izhmash Museum. Back in her hometown, Ekaterina Gurova's life wasn't going great. She had gone through a tough divorce, had no prospects, and was raising a young child alone. Feeling drained and defeated, she decided to start over. She moved with her daughter from Naberezhnya Chelny to Izhevsk, a new city, new experiences, new people. The change brought color back into her life. Ekaterina found work she loved, established herself in the beauty industry, and even had plans to open her own salon. Things were going well, except her personal life wasn't coming together. Despite her striking looks and constant attention from men, Ekaterina wasn't in a hurry to trust anyone. She avoided dating and threw herself into her work until Alexei Tatarkin appeared in her life. They first met in 2007. Alexei worked as a taxi driver. Being noticed by such an attractive woman as Katya was flattering for him, so he turned up the charm. He told Ekaterina that driving a taxi was just a side gig and that by day he was a system administrator for several major companies with 2 degrees in system administration and economics. By this time, Ekaterina was standing on her own 2 feet and didn't need financial support, but the fact that he was educated and seemed ambitious intrigued her. For a while, they kept things strictly friendly. Then, when her ex-husband's business needed a system administrator, Ekaterina thought of Alexei. He got the job, and from that moment, Alexei started to be more involved in her life, driving her and her child to daycare, fixing her computer, walking her dog, and even taking her to visit her parents back in Naberezhnya Chelny. But even with all this attention from Alexei, Katya saw it as just a friend helping out. So, he decided to change his tactics to win her heart. He began to play on her sympathy. One day, Alexei put on quite a show outside the office where Ekaterina worked. He was in tears, telling her he'd caught his wife with another man, and that his wife's aunt had even told him that the kids he thought were his weren't. Even though the whole scene seemed pretty ridiculous, Katya felt empathy for him and offered her support. Alexei kept pulling the sympathy card, claiming that he'd served in Chechnya, was wounded in the head there, and that sometimes he'd go to the funerals of his fallen comrades. The hardships of his life touched something in Ekaterina's heart, and she couldn't just leave him alone. But he finally won her over when he went to Moscow for surgery to remove a bullet supposedly lodged in his head. Alexei called her from the train station, saying he had passed out, and someone had stolen his money and documents. The compassionate Katya rushed to help him, brought him home, and took care of him for an entire week. It was after this incident that they started dating. Unfortunately, only a fraction of what Alexei had told her was true. The rest was a complete fabrication, but at the time, Ekaterina, smitten and unaware, couldn't see through the lies. Relationships built on deception rarely have a future, and problems in their relationship began almost immediately. Once, Alexei took the last 1,000 rubles from Ekaterina's purse just to buy her roses. He didn't seem to care that she was left with no money to even buy food for herself and her child. As time went on, Alexei started persuading Katya to move in together, and after much persistence, she finally agreed. But another surprise awaited her. Alexei suggested they get married. He applied to the registry office 3 times, but Ekaterina kept refusing. Once again, he resorted to dramatic gestures. Alexei Tatarkin would twist his arms in despair, saying he had no one else in the world, and if she turned him down again, he'd end his life. Ekaterina finally gave in, and on August 30th, 2011, their marriage was officially registered. Ekaterina's mother didn't like Alexei from the start. She found him unreliable and felt he wasn't a good match for her daughter. Several times over the phone, she even asked him not to pressure Katya if she wasn't ready to get married. But then one day, she got a call from her daughter. "Mom, I don't know how to say this. We got married." She tried to lighten the mood by joking, "Maybe getting divorced the second time won't be as scary as the first." After the wedding, their life together didn't get any better. They kept arguing about money. Just 2 months after they were married, Alexei Tatarkin started getting heavily involved in Ekaterina's business affairs. He sold the Kamaz trucks she got as part of the property division from her first marriage. With the money, they took a trip to Moscow and bought 3 used foreign cars to fix up and resell later. But in the end, they only got paid for 2 of the cars, and the money for the third seemed to vanish into thin air. Alexei insisted that he'd been scammed, but Ekaterina wasn't buying it anymore. She demanded that he either return the money or give her a car of equal value. Eventually, he wrote her a promissory note for 400,000 rubles, which Katya took to her mother and asked her to keep, just in case. It's worth noting that Ekaterina worked incredibly hard to support the family. She had an extremely busy schedule, sometimes taking on 10 to 12 clients a day and staying at work until as late as 1 a.m. She was paying off the car loan, covering daycare expenses, buying clothes for herself, her daughter and her new husband, paying for gas, car parts, her advanced training courses, and other daily expenses. But whenever Katya tried to talk to Alexei about finances, she'd end up facing another jealous outburst from him, complete with accusations about her living an inappropriate lifestyle. She often told her friends and her mom that she was going to get a divorce and admitted the marriage had been a mistake. But getting Alexei Tatarkin to leave her apartment was nearly impossible. By mid-February 2012, they finally separated, but their arguments continued. Ekaterina Gurova filed for divorce, and just a few days later she disappeared. On May 27, 2012, Ekaterina Gurova, a well-known beauty expert in Izhevsk, was reported missing. On May 28th, Ekaterina's mother decided to call Alexei. She didn't like him and didn't want to reach out, but Ekaterina hadn't answered her phone since the night before and hadn't called back, something that had never happened before. Alexei calmly said he didn't know where Katya was and even promised to check her apartment. But her mother knew Alexei Tatarkin wasn't telling the whole truth. That same day, she managed to find the number of her daughter's friend and reached out to her. From Naberezhnya Chelny, she called local morgues and hospitals and filed a missing person report with the police. The moment she heard the news, Ekaterina's mother rushed to Izhevsk. The apartment her daughter had been renting was locked, and her car was still parked in the courtyard. From that moment on, one of the largest search operations in the city's history began. Katya's friends tried to piece together what might have happened on the day she vanished. According to them, around 2 p.m., she was seen sitting in a cafe with a man. This information supposedly came from one of the waitresses. Afterward, Katya drove home in her car. Security cameras near her building showed that around 3:40 p.m., she parked in the courtyard and went inside. What happened next remains a mystery. Her car stayed in the parking lot, but Katya disappeared without a trace. Katya's mother mentioned that she tried calling her around 6 p.m. The phone rang, but Katya didn't answer. By 11 p.m., her phone was turned off, and no one could reach her. Her loved ones insisted that Katya would never just leave town without telling anyone, even if it was for a short trip. On May 30th, 2012, the investigative department of the Pervomaisky district in Izhevsk, under the investigative committee of the Russian Federation for the Udmurt Republic, launched a criminal case under Part 1 of Article 105 of the Russian Criminal Code, Crime, concerning Ekaterina Gurova's mysterious disappearance. The investigative committee of the Russian Federation for the Udmurt Republic took special control over the investigation. The search continued, and even a month later, Ekaterina was still nowhere to be found. The entire city of Izhevsk was searching for Ekaterina. Flyers with her photo were posted everywhere. Her friends even reached out to psychics for help. Dozens of volunteers, including her friends, acquaintances, and clients, teamed up with the police to search for her. They combed through the suburbs and different parts of the city based on tips from witnesses, but there were still no leads. Despite the tireless efforts of the police and volunteers, no progress was made. So Ekaterina's mother, Olga Gurova, filed complaints with every possible agency in Udmurtia, the republic's prosecutor, and even reached out to the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. She received replies from all the offices stating that her letters had been registered. Only after this did the investigators start showing some renewed interest in the case. Ekaterina's husband was a prime suspect. He had been extremely jealous, and Ekaterina believed he was behind the disappearance of her documents right before their divorce. However, Alexei swore he had nothing to do with Katya's disappearance and claimed he didn't know anything. Right after she went missing, he was detained, questioned, and then released. Alexei then withdrew from the world, turned off his phone, and refused to communicate with anyone. The search continued. Proving Alexei Tatarkin's involvement in Katya's disappearance wasn't easy. The break came thanks to a waitress who'd withdrawn money from Katya's card at Alexei's request. When she saw the missing person posters a few days later, she contacted Katya's mother. Additionally, testimony from a neighbor helped the case. The neighbor had heard a scream coming from Katya's apartment. Other witnesses reported seeing Alexei driving Katya's car on the day she disappeared. The police seized the car, and during the investigation, they found traces of Ekaterina's blood inside. The forensic results came back in early July. By July 10th, Alexei Tatarkin was arrested. He kept insisting he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. He would put on a show during questioning, claiming he felt unwell, and we had to call an ambulance, recalled Yevgeny Fedorov, the lead investigator for high-priority cases with the investigative committee of the Russian Federation for Udmurtia. But the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him. and there was no documented proof that he'd had a minor stroke, as he claimed. On July 12th, during yet another interrogation, he suddenly confessed to killing his wife. Alexei said he confessed because he was terrified. According to him, Ekaterina had been appearing to him in his dreams every night, talking to him and driving him insane. His confession came as a tragic gift on the eve of what would have been her birthday. On July 13th, the murdered Ekaterina Gorova would have turned 27, but even after confessing, he continued to mislead the investigation. One moment he claimed he committed the crime on the banks of the Kama River, and the next, he couldn't remember where he hid the remains. There were many odd details in the case of the young woman's disappearance, but the painstaking work of investigators helped piece together the sequence of events leading up to the crime against Ekaterina Gorova. The last person to see Katya alive was one of her students, Alina. They met at a cafe around 2 or 3 p.m. on May 27th. She wanted to open a beauty salon, Alina recalled. She wanted to hire me. We had just started talking when Katya's phone rang. From what I understood, the caller told her that someone had posted her personal messages online. Katya tried to check the internet on her phone but couldn't access anything. She said she was going home and would be back in about 30 minutes. She asked me to wait for her, the witness said. On her way home, Katya called her husband. They were already in the process of getting a divorce, and she suspected he was the one who had posted her messages, as he was very tech-savvy. She arranged to meet him at the building on Udmurtskaya Street, 161, where she'd been renting an apartment for the past 2 months after they'd separated. According to Alexei Tatarkin, they met in the building's entryway, and an argument broke out almost immediately. Katya accused him of leaking her personal messages with another man. In response, Alexei launched into accusations of his own. I asked my wife if the rumors I'd heard about her seeing other men were true. Her response basically implied I'd be an idiot not to have figured it out by now, Alexei told investigators. Without thinking, I grabbed a knife and stabbed Katya in the chest. After the stab, Katya collapsed to the floor. I caught her. I sat there on the floor with Katya lying on my knees. I stayed like that for about 10 minutes, and then she stopped showing signs of life. When I came to my senses, I realized I had taken her life. I took the knife and began dismembering the body to cover my tracks. A neighbor of Ekaterina's reported hearing a woman scream that lasted about 5 minutes. It sounded muffled at times, as if someone was covering her mouth. Afterward, the sound of running water could be heard in the bathroom for several hours. What Alexei Tatarkin did next was far from the behavior of someone acting in a blind rage. It seemed like everything he did was carefully calculated to create a perfect alibi. He didn't call an ambulance or attempt to save his wife. Instead, he cold-bloodedly dismembered her body into 9 pieces and packed them into garbage bags. Afterward, he sent 2 text messages from Katya's phone to his own, one saying she had gone for a drive and another saying she'd call him the next day. That same evening, he used her laptop to send messages pretending to be her, further throwing the investigation off track. Around 9 p.m., he took the bags outside and loaded them into a car he had received from a client for repairs the day before. He buried some of the remains near the village of Chilton and left the rest at a landfill near the village of Vozhoi in the Zabyolovsky district. After that, he calmly went home and continued watching as the entire city searched for the woman he had already buried. The official funeral for Ekaterina Gorova took place on July 17, 2012. She was laid to rest in a closed casket. First, a memorial service was held for her in Izhevsk, and then the hearse transported her coffin to Naberezhnya Chelny. Katya's family chose to bury her next to her father's grave. Many of her father's former colleagues came to say their goodbyes to Ekaterina and shared stories about how much he had adored his Tatyunya. Valery Gurov had worked for many years as an anesthesiologist at the perinatal center, but in October 2008, at just 45 years old, he passed away suddenly from cancer. Ekaterina left behind a 6-year-old daughter named Nastya, so why did her husband decide to confess to the crime a month and a half later? Katya's mother, Olga Gurova, suspected that even his confession was part of a calculated plan. She believed he waited just long enough so that the remains wouldn't be able to reveal exactly how the crime had been committed. There's plenty of information online about how, where, and at what rate a human body decomposes. It's possible that Alexei Tatarkin timed everything and only revealed the body when it was too late to determine how many wounds he inflicted or the exact way he attacked Katya. And what about the motive? Was it really just jealousy, or were there other reasons? If we go back to the beginning of their relationship, it's clear that their biggest fights were always about money. And indeed, Alexei Tatarkin had a complicated relationship with money. For example, according to Olga Gurova, Katya would give him the money to make monthly payments on her car loan. But starting in May 2011, those payments stopped. Meanwhile, Alexei kept promising Katya that he would soon pay off the loan entirely. Even during the investigation, he continued to insist that he'd been making regular payments out of his own pocket and that he'd given all the receipts to Katya. But in November 2011, a collection agency that had purchased the debt from the bank called a number listed in their database, which turned out to be Alexei's. He told them that his wife had been in a car accident, was in the hospital, and couldn't speak, but promised they would start paying off the loan soon. He managed to drag this out until May 2012. After Katya's death, he told them that now he was the one in the hospital. Money issues were at the root of most of the major arguments in their relationship. Katya was unhappy with the fact that Alexei didn't have a steady source of income, but seemed to have endless expenses for what he claimed were business ventures. Gurova and Tatarkin were complete opposites. She was open and honest, while he was cunning and greedy. And to top it off, he was extremely jealous. To be fair, there was some basis for Tatarkin's jealousy. During the trial, Alexei's friends testified that he had repeatedly asked them to spy on his wife. During one of these stakeouts, they caught Ekaterina flirting with another man. Moreover, with his background as a system administrator and computer expert, Alexei secretly monitored her social media messages, which only fueled his jealousy further. Alexei Tatarkin could be described as emotionally unstable, and any concern he showed for Ekaterina was just an act. The investigation also revealed that Alexei didn't have a college degree at all. He hadn't even finished one course of study, and he had never served in the military, let alone in Chechnya, as he had claimed. The entire criminal case was documented in 7 thick volumes, containing testimony from dozens of witnesses, results from multiple forensic reports, and descriptions of investigative actions. To recap, Ekaterina Gurova disappeared on the night of May 27th last year. For a month and a half, not only her family and the police, but also teams of volunteers searched for her, combing through nearby forests, checking basements, and exploring abandoned buildings. From the court verdict, one witness stated, Tatarkin constantly picked fights and argued with Gurova. Before they got married, Gurova had decided to withdraw her marriage application, and in response, Tatarkin attempted suicide. In February 2012, Gurova left Tatarkin and started living separately. In early May, Tatarkin pretended to have a stroke. Their divorce hearing was scheduled for June 6, 2012. Gurova trusted Tatarkin to handle her loan payments. From Tatarkin's own testimony, I put the body parts in trash bags and carried them to my car, a Vaz 21053. Then I drove to the village of Nechkino. I took the bags with Gurova's body parts from the trunk and tried to sink them in the river, but they wouldn't sink. I tied bags of bricks with rope to the torso, but they came loose. After that, I drove from Nechkino back toward Izhevsk. When he returned to the apartment, Tatarkin cleaned the floors and wiped away the blood. He gathered the blood-stained items in a bag and, along with the rest of the body parts in other bags, placed them back in the car. At that moment, he noticed a message had popped up on Gurova's laptop from one of her friends. Pretending to be Ekaterina, he replied that she had supposedly gone out of town for a drive. To create an alibi for himself, the killer also sent 2 text messages from her phone to his own, saying that Katya was asking him not to worry and that she would definitely call him back the next day. From the testimony of the accused, Tatarkin, I left the torso in a wooded area on the left side of the road. I covered the bags with leaves but didn't bury them. The bags were about 30 yards apart. I left the sweater I was wearing at the time of the crime there as well. Then I drove to Zavyalovo, onto the Staropolsky highway, and after reaching the sign for Stary Chiltum, I turned right and buried the remaining body parts along with the clothes. As the witness statements were being read in court, Ekaterina's mother, Olga, became overwhelmed. Unable to contain her sobs, she had to step out into the hallway where paramedics were called for her. The judge took nearly an hour and a half to read the verdict. Alexei Tatarkin was sentenced to 9 years and 6 months in a maximum security penal colony. The prosecutor had requested a 10-year sentence. There was no appeal. Neither Ekaterina Gurova's family lawyer nor her mother was present for the sentencing. None of Alexei's relatives attended either. Attached to the criminal case was a claim for damages, where Ekaterina's mother requested 5 million rubles for emotional distress. She also submitted documents seeking reimbursement for funeral expenses totaling 30,000 rubles. The court approved reimbursement of funeral expenses. However, regarding the 5 million rubles in emotional compensation, the court suggested that Ekaterina's mother file a separate civil lawsuit. As the verdict was being read, Alexei Tatarkin's face remained expressionless. The one thing he seemed relieved about was that Katya had stopped appearing in his dreams. It's heartbreaking to think of this wonderful woman who never got the chance to escape from the monster she married. With her kind and hopeful nature, Ekaterina saw light where there was only darkness, and she failed to see the evil in Alexei. Maybe the problem is that from a young age women are told they absolutely need a man by their side, that without him they're somehow incomplete. This mindset leads to a kind of self-esteem that makes it easy to end up married to whoever comes along. How little must she have valued herself to let a man stay in her life who couldn't even buy her flowers with his own money and had to steal from her purse? Why are we, as women, so blind? Katya realized early on that he was a phony, not a real man. A loving man would protect his woman, would make her happy with even the smallest gifts, just to see her smile. But by then, Katya was already trapped in his snare, one she couldn't escape alive. In 2022, Alexei Tatarkin was released and returned to Ijevsk. So much for justice. But we're not the ones who write the laws or make the decisions. What we can do is learn from stories like this. This case should serve as a warning to beautiful, successful women, those who are so confident in themselves and the goodness of the world that they end up choosing someone who seems like a devoted servant, a reliable partner, a simple guy who manages to worm his way into your life. You trust him with everything, your children, your property, thinking he's so loyal. But sooner or later, that same guy will stab you in the back because deep down, he knows he'll never reach or experience the success you have, and that realization will eat away at his ego, slowly and painfully. Justice comes from above, and sooner or later this criminal will face it.